Hey, Gabe.
Hey, what's up, Tim?
We watched the movie Sum of All Fears today, and it got me thinking. What happens when you try to sum up all of your fears on a podcast, but your greatest fear, even more than global thermonuclear war, is doing math in public?
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
Welcome to another episode of the Super Critical Podcast, where we delve into the fun and oftentimes nonsensical way pop culture portrays nuclear weapons. My name is Tim Westmyer, someone who studies nuclear weapons and works on nuclear security for a living. I am joined in the podcast studio / my basement with my co-host Gabe. Gabe, welcome back.
Hey, hello, all nuclear people out there. Good to be back, Tim.
Great. Our usual, old podcast host, Joel, was not able to make it here today because he and his wife welcomed a new child into the world, and they decided, for some weird reason, they didn't want to expose it to a movie about nuclear war and Nazis that early in life.
I can't imagine why.
Fair enough, but congratulations to him and his wife. Fortunately, we are joined over Skype today by Jon Duke of Vortex Aereo Media. Jon, welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
So what is Vortex Aereo Media? Because I know we've met on Twitter, we chatted quite a bit, but what is your service and what expertise do you bring to bear today on the podcast?
So I, up until 2016, I flew helicopters for the Royal Navy, and then I started a small company, Vortex Aereo Media, with a friend of mine, Lloyd Horgan, who's a very good photographer, and we provide media facilities for the defence and aerospace industry. So we do a bit of copywriting, photography, video, that sort of thing, for either aerospace companies or the related media magazines, that sort of thing.
Very, very cool. I know you had some time recently to sit inside the cockpit of one of the helicopters from a movie we covered on the podcast, Mission Impossible Fallout. So it's fun. You kind of mixed, your life is very much mixed between nuke movies, real movies, and the other parts of aerospace. It's really cool.
And John, am I correct? Are you the one who gave us the Atom Splitter beer for the atomic alcohol episode?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I sent a few of those over.
Thank you. That was my favorite beer from the episode, so thank you very much for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a really nice drink.
Yeah, a good English bitter. All right, so what are we here to talk about? We're here to talk about the 2002 movie Sum of All Fears, which is the second Tom Clancy book about Jack Ryan that we covered on the podcast, the other one being The Hunt for Red October. It is the second Ben Affleck vehicle we've covered, because we also did Batman vs. Superman, but it is the first to feature an Austrian neo-Nazi trying to spark a nuclear war between the United States and Russia, although to be fair, the last time we covered a very similar plot, the villain was Swedish, so in Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. So it's different enough, right?
Yeah, no, I think different country, same continent, different country. I think we're good.
Yeah, this kind of story comes up quite a lot. Trying to start a war between the U.S. and Russia, different ways of going about it.
Yeah, it was like, how many villains can you have doing? I mean, okay, like the former disgruntled Soviet general, neo-Nazi, Middle Eastern terrorist group. There's just so many you can do.
They need to have a war where it's like the Canadians tried to start something.
Something completely unexpected, yeah.
Yeah. So this movie, The Sum of All Fears, was directed by Phil Alden Robinson, who directed also Field of Dreams.
Wow.
One of Joel's favorite movies as well, Sneakers. I don't know if you heard of that one. It's a fun one with Sidney Poitier and a bunch of others. He also wrote the Sylvester Stallone Dolly Parton movie Rhinestone. So what a range on that guy, right?
That is, yeah, I would not take those movies to be done by the same person. That's very interesting, actually.
Yeah, but there's quite a cast here too. So what are your favorite cast members here, John, in terms of the people in this film?
Kind of like the president, actually. I think
James Cromwell.
Yeah, I haven't seen him in a bunch of stuff. It seems like he's maybe a little bit typecast, because every time I think I've seen maybe 50% of the time I've seen the president in a film, it's James Cromwell. He's either playing the president or some senior military guy. But I thought he did a really competent job of giving the impression of a president who's completely under control, when things are going well, and then the things start to unravel when the pressure's on. Other than that, Morgan Freeman, I thought did a really good job of not actually being Morgan Freeman too much.
Mm-hmm.
in this one.
Director of the CIA.
He was good as kind of like a badass, like seasoned, gritty veteran of the intelligence infrastructure.
He mentions at one point on because I watched the special features for the DVD, that the previous people who played Cabot or the CIA director, James Earl Jones, and other things, they never got to do anything. They were always like in a room, but they weren't able to go out in the field and all that. So he was like, excited that his role was a little meatier. But I think it's kind of funny because James Cromwell and Morgan Freeman were in a White House together in a previous movie, but the roles were reversed. In Deep Impact, Morgan Freeman was the president and James Cromwell, I forget exactly what his role was, but he was like a high-level advisor to deal with asteroids and things. So you also got Ben Affleck in the starring role for Jack Ryan. That was right after Pearl Harbor. I think he got offered the part while he was filming Pearl Harbor with Alec Baldwin, who's also a previous Jack Ryan, so he asked him for permission if it was okay to take on the mantle and all that stuff.
Was this movie around the time of like peak Ben Affleck? Like, where was this in relation to Geely and yeah?
Is that's
kind of
peak?
I think the end was Geely.
Okay, so that's the precipice where it starts to fall.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't committed that date to memory.
Okay.
But sure, that sounds about right. That's before he got into directing.
Okay, yeah.
And then
Of course, yeah.
And then we also have, I would never pronounce this guy's name correctly, Syrian Hines, who plays the president of Russia. You may recognize him from The King Beyond the Wall in Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I thought he was really good in this as well.
Yeah,
actually.
great.
And I understand that he learned some of his Russian dialogue in pretty short time.
Yeah, like
from
phonetically,
one of the
pretty
scenes.
much.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of Russian dialogue in this too,
Yeah.
so you can't hide it. You can't hide behind a couple of lines.
We like the characters here and everything, but what did the audience and critics think of this? I did the research because it's been a while. This is one of the first Nuke movies I've ever seen in the theater. I think it might actually be the first one. So it's very fond memories for me seeing it, but because I think I liked the movie when it came out. But looking back on it, decidedly mixed. According to Box Office Mojo, it made a lot of money. It made over $190 million worldwide on like a $70 million budget. So not too bad, but it wasn't, it didn't spawn a whole bunch of more Jack Ryan movies with Ben Affleck. It was one of the last Jack Ryan movies for a long time.
Was this, do we think this was intended to be like the start of a series? Okay. I didn't
think
know
so.
that. Yeah.
Bridget Moynahan, who plays Jack Ryan's lady friend, like a nurse or doctor.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell what her job was.
She's like
Doctor.
in residence or something.
Right, residence, right. She says in the junket that she hopes that people will like Ben Affleck so that they can do a bunch more.
Well, too bad nobody likes Ben Affleck, so.
Bummer.
Kind of a funny place to start, though, isn't it? With the Sum of All Fears, if you're going to have a young Jack or a younger Jack Ryan, because in the book series afterwards, it's kind of very quickly becomes Jack Ryan, in senior government staff, and then as the president. And I can't really see Ben Affleck carrying that off as what was he, mid-30s, mid-late 30s?
I guess they would just do a lot more of the early Jack Ryan stuff. I think in the book, I've not read the book, Sum of All Fears, but in the book, he's the deputy director of the CIA when this is happening. Well, I have a couple points on that we'll get to in the plot part of it, but I do like the fact that it's an early Jack Ryan story instead of it just being like after Claire Present Danger or something. Rotten Tomatoes, that kind of brings together all the critics. Only 59% of people that reviewed this movie thought it was good. That's not great. It's not certified fresh. It's rotten. The consensus summary on the website is a slick and well-made thriller that takes on new weight due to the current political climate. I'm not sure if that meant 2002 or 2019.
I gotta say, the whole time I'm watching this movie and you see President Fowler and the nuclear codes, and I'm just thinking, holy, you know what? Like, that would be Donald Trump. Like, the whole time, that's what I'm thinking.
Remember that when we talk about the two-man rule, when they try to use the nuclear football to launch, because the movie gets it right, the book gets it wrong.
Okay.
And we'll just remember that little bit of slice of preview when we talk about it later.
Okay.
They did try to make this as accurate as possible. The producers of the film sought out military and government officials to advise them on the film. One of the people that was helping there was Air Force Liaison Chief Charles E. Davis, and according to him, it was probably one of the most technically correct films in a long time.
He's going to say that, though, isn't he?
Right, that's his job.
The guy whose job is to make it realistic,
At least one of the producers, Mace Newfield, said, having such support from government and military added verisimilitude that could not otherwise have been achieved on screen. They at least thought it was pretty accurate. But what do we think? Let's get into that part of it here.
Yeah, that's why we're here, right?
Right? We have a little bit of a mix of perspectives. Like me, I live and breathe nuclear policy for a living and think about that stuff at my spare time. I'm on Nuke Map on the weekends. Gabe, you're not into it except for talking to me.
Yeah.
You have your own regular life.
Yeah.
And then John is somewhere in the middle, former military, really enthusiastic about watching these kind of films and thinking and talking about them. So really curious to see our different perspectives.
Well, and it's good because in the movie, Jack Ryan, he's also former military, has moved on to, well, not really civilian life, quasi-civilian life. So John is a good,
I think Jack Ryan's a former Navy guy, right?
Marines, I think.
Marines, right?
Yeah.
He seemed better able to get around, certainly in the latter part of the film, than perhaps I would have managed, having been in a helicopter accident. But we can talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in The Hunt for Red October they talk about that he was laid up. He got in an injury coming out of a helicopter, and he finished all of his tests and things while he was like in traction.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Crazy.
So Tim, you've mentioned a few times that there's this book out there, and I guess before we start all this, spoiler alert: if you haven't read the book, if you haven't watched the movie, stop the podcast, go do that, and then come back and listen to this. But does the movie kind of follow the book largely, or have there been some changes made?
So the biggest difference in the book versus the movie, Jack Ryan is much more senior in his career in the book. He's already married. He is, I think, the deputy director of the CIA. He negotiates a peace deal that works over Jerusalem, basically trying to turn it into the Vatican style arrangement, and it works. He brings people together. Everything looks like it's going to be fine, and this arrangement does not really suit well for some people. There is a person who is a high-ranking U.S. security advisor. I forget her actual role, but she's romantically linked to the now widowed president, and she hates Jack Ryan. She hates the fact that he is so an upstart, so popular. So she tries to stop the deal.
Okay.
Convinces President Fowler that Jack Ryan is no good. And also there are Arab nationalists, kind of a Palestinian Front type group, who doesn't want the deal to take place. So they are the ones trying to start a nuclear war to disrupt the peace process.
Am I recalling correctly? Didn't they make some changes because of 9/11? Because I think this movie came out shortly after 9/11. I seem to recall, because I was actually a big fan of this movie at the time, and I think they wanted to change the antagonist group from Middle Eastern terrorists to something else that would be more, not maybe strike at people so much.
So the movie was released in 2002, but it was written in early 2001.
Okay.
So it was before all of this. The director claimed it had already been written like years before, and it was meant to have Harrison Ford in it.
Okay.
But then Harrison Ford dropped out. The director dropped out. Who had done some of the previous Jack Ryan movies, so they had to redo everything, start from scratch. So it was changed, but the thought was, ironically, that they didn't think that Arab nationalists could pull off an attack like that.
Oh, really? Okay.
You can't go wrong with using Nazis as a villain, though, can you?
Yeah.
You're not going to turn off that much of your audience.
Right.
Everyone hates Nazis.
Well, this is kind of, we'll get into a little bit later, but they changed it to this like rising fascist movements, right-wing political parties in Europe, and they decided that would be the major thrust of everything.
A little prescient, a little
sad.
Somebody
true.
had a crystal ball out. It's interesting.
Yep. A lot of the other parts of the movie track. There's a nuclear threat at a Super Bowl. The president is involved. There's other things, but there's other places where it's different. I think we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's the main thrust of it, and then the other scenes have been added from other Jack Ryan books.
Okay.
As well. But let's get started into this movie. As Gabe mentioned, spoiler warning, if you haven't seen the film, go out and see it. We're going to spoil it because that's how we do it.
From the electrifying bestseller by Tom Clancy.
The crate was put on a cargo freighter headed for the East Coast.
What? And the producer of Clear and Present Danger and Patriot Games.
It's Ryan! The bomb is in play!
Ben Affleck.
Where's the president now?
They're taking him airborne. They think it might be the Russians.
It wasn't the Russians!
Morgan Freeman.
It adds up. You just don't like what it adds up to.
If you strike against the Russians, you sacrifice your moral authority.
We have reason to believe the bomb was the work of terrorists, not the Russians. And if you shut me out, your family and 25 million other families will be dead.
The Sum of All Fears. Directed by Phil Alden Robinson.
Let's start with the opening text on the screen. Gabe, why don't you read us the background here?
All right. 29 years ago, in 1973, a single A-4 Israeli jet loaded with a nuclear bomb takes off during the Yom Kippur War with Egypt and Syria when it looked like Israel would be defeated.
It looks like it's either implying that Israel is about to use a nuclear weapon, or at least they're trying to put it into the field to make the other side think that they should back down. It's not entirely clear, but before we even figure that out, the pilot gets distracted by a picture of their family, and they get shot down.
Yeah,
by a
because
surface-to-air
any
missile.
pilot would not be looking outside; he'd be looking down at pictures while flying. So
It's always a picture of the wife and kids, isn't it? It does so.
Yeah.
It's such a well-used trope.
Yeah, John. Whenever you fly, do you always take that, like, put photographs, put a little collage on the panel for you?
Oh yeah. Most of my time flying helicopters was exercising my artistic bent, putting together portfolios on the usually over the really important instruments.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Well, I think Gabe, you have, every time I fly with you, you have a picture of your cat. So I don't know.
Yeah, right. He's always got to be up there. Yeah, or else the plane doesn't fly if the picture's not there. It's very important equipment.
Well, it's kind of funny. I was about to say your cat named Captain is your co-pilot, but then it would be really confusing that the captain is your co-pilot.
Yeah, that's why we don't talk. We just put the picture up.
That's definitely an airplane confusion. Like Roger, Roger, over.
Yeah, right, exactly.
All right, so the pilot's distracted. He's shot down, and where's the bomb go? Well, it kind of gets buried in the desert amongst the wreckage. And good Scorpion acting. The Scorpion comes right up to the screen. I don't know how they train Scorpions to do that, but that's really impressive.
Yeah, that was the best paid. They found the best paid, most experienced Scorpion in Hollywood for that one. Yeah.
He couldn't get the role of Scorpion King later on with The Rock, but it's hard to get that. So we've covered broken arrow incidents. Broken arrows are when the military, civilians, or whoever happens to be in control of the nuclear weapon at the time loses it. We covered that on the movie Broken Arrow, number 4 of our podcast. So get into that more on that particular episode. But
so this war, though, I mean, there's been so many conflicts in that area. I mean, I didn't know anything about this. Do you know anything about this conflict? Is this an actual thing that happened?
It definitely was. There was a series of wars in 1973. There was a 6-day war conflict a couple years before that when Israel its military was starting to get stronger, and at that particular moment, Egypt and Syria and other countries in the region they don't get along that well, Gabe. They certainly have had a number of conflicts, but this particular one on our Facebook page, facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast, Nathan, who's a listener, asked whether or not Israel actually had nukes in this war, in the theater of this conflict, or if it was just a made-up plot MacGuffin. So similar question here. It is a really fascinating moment in history. During this conflict, Israel was caught off guard when it was a surprise attack from Egypt and Syria. It was a big intelligence failure. They really didn't know that this was happening, and even when they said, all right, something's going to happen today by evening time, they got it messed up. It happened like around the afternoon. So the conflict happened very quickly. Israel was caught off guard, and eventually on October 9th of 1973, Israel had already lost 50 aircraft, 500 tanks. It seemed like they were days away from defeat, to the point where the defense minister brought up the idea of using nuclear weapons in a meeting with the prime minister, saying that the country was, quote, on the point of last resort and the end of the third temple, which is coincidentally also the code name Israel has for its nuclear weapons, Temple. Instead of doing that, the Prime Minister, Golda Meir, requested that the United States send over really fast some military aid, some new tanks, stuff to replete their losses. And she also put her Jericho missiles on high alert, and they were nuclear capable. Reports were that she authorized the assembly of 13 tactical nuclear weapons of around 20 kilotons each, and put them on the Jericho missiles, and not on A4s, but on the F4 Phantom II aircraft.
That's what I was going to say, because that A4 Skyhawk, it's a light attack airplane. That's not,
It is nuclear capable.
Oh, it is, okay.
And it can carry this weapon.
Okay.
But it was not the one that they were using in the field, according to all the reports that I saw.
Very interesting.
And they did this in a way that would be very recognizable by the Americans. They weren't hiding this, because the idea was Kissinger would see this and go, oh crud, there's about to be a nuclear conflict, let's send over military aid before things get out of hand.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you think your country is really on the brink of basically being, and it sounds like this was an existential threat to the state of Israel. If you think your country is about to be obliterated, I guess that's when you start to have those discussions.
That's why you have them, right?
Yeah.
That's the thought process there. So Kissinger eventually offered military aid. This was called Operation Nickel Glass, and the tide turned in Israel's favor, and they were able to push back against the advances. If you really want to read more about this, there's a great book written in 1998 by Avner Cohen called Israel and the Bomb that talks quite a bit about this particular phase in Israel's nuclear history. There's no evidence that there was a plane flying around with...
Okay, so that's
this is movie
plot device,
book plot, but it makes sense. I don't know, John. This seems like a pretty credible setup to me.
Yeah, I mean there are some. I would be surprised if I don't know. I'd be surprised if it was just one aircraft flying around on its own. You know, would you put it over hostile territory, or would you keep it, in your own airspace?
Mm-hmm.
But that's detail, isn't it? It works as a device to get it's an easier device to get a nuclear warhead out in the wild than would be having it on a missile of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also interested in how that played out with regard to the sort of Israeli deterrence plan, because that strikes me as I didn't know any of that you've just said, and it strikes me as a bit of a failure in the deterrent that they could get to that point and then have to use what's supposed to be their deterrent capability to influence an ally.
A lot of countries have had weapons for that exact purpose. So South Africa had a very robust nuclear weapons program. They built, I think it's around 12 or so nuclear devices that they could have assembled and put into the field, but they never tested them. They never had an intention of putting them on weapons that could be delivered, maybe aircraft potentially, but their thought was a bomb in the basement. It's something that we have that we can use, and if it got to the point where the Soviet Union looked like it was going to use its proxies and nearby countries around South Africa, that it would, because they were involved in civil conflicts there. If it looked like it was going to get bad, that they were going to get overrun, then they were going to test a weapon near the border. And then that would bring the international community to help them. But they never intended, as far as we know, to use it against the enemy. It was going to be a test. Look, this is getting bad. International community step in to stop it.
Right.
Israel's weapons are kind of a mix between the two of those. Is it a deterrence failure? That's a really good argument. That's certainly an argument that a lot of people who think that we should get rid of nuclear weapons, they always point to the fact that Israel has bombs, but it's been invaded a number of occasions since it had it. But I guess the thought there is, well, because they weren't forwardly deployed at that time, there wasn't a credibility that Israel would actually use the weapons at a certain point. These are real questions, and it takes a long time for deterrence, especially under these unique situations of people not having an overt nuclear program. Where do you draw the lines?
I guess it's different as well, because they're kind of in the what I guess the Russians and the Americans would refer to as tactical weapons.
Mm-hmm.
They don't. It doesn't really have the same. There would need to be a further escalation into a strategic exchange for it to be globally devastating. So
Right.
I guess it doesn't quite occupy the minds of big powers in the same way. I don't know, maybe it does, but
Well, one of the things that I was curious by the movie is it's one jet with one tactical weapon. Obviously, this is not the start of a continual war fight using nuclear weapons to destroy tank battalions, and because tactical weapons are meant to be used on the battlefield in small situations. Strategic weapons are usually they tend to be larger. They're launched by missiles further away. They target cities. They target the other side's nuclear weapons. They're meant to be more like the strategic deterrence, and tactical weapons are battlefield weapons. The line isn't super clear, but 20 kilotons, it's not the smallest nuclear weapon ever. It's larger than the one that was used against Hiroshima, which was around 16 kilotons. It's still, what was the purpose of this jet? Were they going to launch one weapon, drop one weapon, and then say, we have more that we could use? That sounds like the plan.
got shades of escalate to de-escalate, hasn't it?
Right, exactly. We have more that we can do. We're holding something back. Now the ball is in your court, but we can do more if we need to.
Yeah. We were talking about this before we started. This movie is just full of all these scenes that elicit all these questions, because the movie is so full of these rich details, and you could just pick all this apart for hours. But to me, once I started thinking about this more, if you just watch it on face value, you're like, oh, okay, plane, nuclear weapon, whatever. But then you start thinking about all these questions, like, why is the plane flying so low to the ground? What is the plane going to do? Is it actually going to drop the bomb? All these kind of things you just start thinking about. And it's just an interesting feature of, I guess, a Tom Clancy movie where, you start to get into this stuff.
It's a very interesting premise to start the film, because then you're always wondering, well, is this movie going to be about Israel? Is it going to be about the Middle East? No, it's not, because the next scene we see, and I kind of really like the way the movie starts to do transitions, where it starts...
It's like a satellite
spy satellite
photo of where they're going to be, yeah.
Accurate spy satellite of the next place we're about to go to, which is called Mount Weather, Virginia. It is a continuity of government location where civilian officials would go to, in the White House, would go to that particular facility to fight a nuclear war, to survive a conflict. There's a couple other locations. Raven Rock out in Pennsylvania is where the Pentagon would go. Greenbrier Resort used to be the place where Congress would go. They probably would go to Mount Weather now. So we accurate satellite imagery, we scan down, and then we see the president doing a little West Wing walk and talk with the rest of his cabinet, and he's in there.
Yeah, it's like quick camera cuts and tough talk about, there's a situation in Russia. I guess there's been a coup, and There's an incoming nuclear strike.
The 12 to 15 megaton bombs, really huge weapons.
Yeah, and they're talking about there was this coup in Russia. A rogue general has taken control. They don't know, who's in power and all this kind of thing. I guess president goes to DEFCON 1, and then the military commander starts the whole process to actually get the nuclear briefcase out, the football out, and start to go through that.
Yep, they run through. They say they're 25 minutes from a strike. There's incoming weapons from subs. There's incoming SS-18 missiles from really... And they keep dropping names and stuff, accurate locations for where all these things tend to be stored. President goes to DEFCON 1. The military commander there says it'll take 1 minute from when the order is given to when the weapons are, I guess, missiles are in the air. They start the process. There's an ID check.
Yeah.
The president pulls out a card from his jacket and he says, fifth from the top. There's a mention of a 2-man rule, and the national security advisor steps up and does something. He authenticates the order.
Yeah. And
it looks bad, right?
Yeah, it looks really bad. So, John, I'm going to ask you, when you were watching this, did you think this was a real thing that was going on, or did you have some suspicion that this might be a...
When I watched it the first time, as far as I can remember, I kind of had my suspicions that, okay, yeah, this is going to be... we're not going into a full strategic exchange like 2 minutes in. Surely that's going to be a really... It's either going to be like the bleak... Is that we're looking at Threads 2, or it's going to be a pretty long slog. So no, I did have my suspicions that it was a drill, and it kind of does a good job of describing the way it's supposed to work. So you've got a frame of reference for later on in the film.
Yeah,
it's a really great setup.
Yeah, no. So sure enough, yeah, it is a drill. The president, I think, gets a call from his wife about some gala event. But what I'd want to, I guess, bookmark for later is I thought it was interesting that during this drill part, everything's like so orderly, and it's almost like they're just following the script, and everyone's acting very rationally and calm and saying, "You do this, I'm going to do this, you're going to do this," and it all works like clockwork in this drill. So we'll check mark that for later.
I love that part. My favorite part was that the wife calls, and I could see a world where if you didn't know what was happening, you're like, oh, he's going to say goodbye.
Yeah, exactly.
And then no, it's like, all right, we're going to have to cancel this. That was funny. I really, when I saw that again, I was like, that's kind of funny. That's a good line.
Yeah. So, okay, so does this kind of stuff happen? I mean, will they get the president and everyone together to do this kind of thing on a regular basis?
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about Mount Weather quite a lot on a recent podcast episode that we did about Madam Secretary, the TV show with Tia Leone, where she's the Secretary of State. So if you want more about that, go check that episode out. This process, these drills, they actually get pretty good in the movie. Not the book, but the movie. These drills happen quite a lot. It's one of the last thing you do as a civilian before you become the president. Usually this is done at Blair House, which is a place right next to the White House where the presidents tend to stay before they are inaugurated. The military comes in and they run through the drill and they say, here's what would happen. Here's how you use the deterrent, because otherwise, if they don't know what they're doing, Russians or whoever could start a war on the first day as soon as they're inaugurated and have the power.
Do you know, do new presidents get any? They get the process, the procedure of how to actually fire the missiles, or to give the order. Do you know if they get any, like a primer on nuclear strategy, nuclear thinking, and how these things actually function and what the effects are? Because I was going through a phase of training when President Trump was inaugurated that focused a lot on international relations and everything else. One of the concerns was, here's a guy who's out with everything else. He's never served in government before. He's probably not been exposed to these issues and the real horrible facts about how these things work.
I'm sure he's seen the movie, so it's probably fine. Yeah.
Do you know if they get anything like that, or is it just, well, you're the president now, so it's kind of your call, but you can launch the nukes at any moment?
So I remember when I was reading an old Bob Woodward book, I think about the Bush White House. They talked a little bit about the training that goes on after election, but before inauguration. And they do receive a crash course on a lot of stuff, including strategic deterrence issues and things like that, war fighting. They're not given the drill on how to use the weapons until they're almost inaugurated, but they're given the information. A crash course. It's one of those things. Obama wanted a lot of information. So he got a ton of briefings on Pakistan, on North Korea, wars in the Middle East and Afghanistan. I don't know. I haven't read the latest Bob Woodward book, so I don't know how much of that Trump got, because he was going through a lot of other issues at the time. I think it's one of those things, you get it when you want it.
Okay.
I'm not sure if he's done one of these Mount Weather drills, but they do those things quite a lot. They'll run through war fighting things, and sometimes they bring the principal in. Other times it's other people that'll be in the room. The rest of the drill looked pretty good. You know, some things that we see, the card that the president brings out, it's called, you know, nicknamed the Biscuit. It is a list. It's like a baseball card sized card with a list of codes, and the president has to know which of them are real and which of them are decoys. That is the most important thing. You pull out that card, you say the fifth from the top, and you read. Normally you read it, but I guess if the guy's in the room, you can just say fifth from the top. And that is the code that says the president is who they say they are. Gotcha. And that's kind of it. That's all you need to launch an attack. The two-man rule, the way it works in reality, is the president issues the order. They need someone on the other side. Usually it's the Secretary of Defense, but it can also be the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State down the line, has to say, yes, this is the president. This is a correct order. Not like correct in the sense of what they're going to do, but that is the president. If that person says no, the president can fire that person and go down to the next person. And they go down until they find someone that will agree to do it.
Wait, what? Are you serious?
There's no veto power over the president's use of nuclear weapons.
So all they're agreeing to is that they know that it is the president. They're not agreeing to I agree that we should carry it. Wow. Yeah.
That's it. So that's what it's not the same thing as in a launch facility bunker, a silo, or a submarine where two people need to turn a key at the same time, otherwise it won't work. It's not like that.
That's very interesting. No, and I thought it was a check on, you need somebody else to like confirm the decision and, a check on the president's power.
There's no check. The only thing you can do is you can refuse an order, but that's not the system. That's the system breaking down. The rule is that you need a second person to authenticate that the president is who they say they are and that the order is correct.
Well, thank you, Tim. Every time I come on this podcast, I'm usually not able to sleep for a week. So I thank you for
well, that's the whole thing.
For achieving that objective again.
Now, there is stuff in the news the last couple of weeks where some people have said that because now the Secretary of Defense has resigned, Jim Mattis, and there are reports that said that he inserted himself into the process and said, do not let the president receive an order that there's an incoming strike and let him decide to actually launch without calling me, because I will do something about it.
Wow.
That's what people have said that. No one has come out and said that that's correct. It's mostly just rumors and things like that. If they did that, it would be one of the biggest destroying the rules of civilian military relations ever, that I can think of in terms of the use of nuclear weapons. Yeah. So it is in the news, but it's not the way it's supposed to work. So it would be a usurping of the policy. One more thing here is I love certain things in this movie. One of them is the nuclear football is way more realistic than other films because it's just a fancy telephone.
There's no wire sticking out of it. There's no
biometric put your hand on it and it scans, or there's no video conferencing or flashing lights and things. It's basically a telephone. There's no red button. There's no launch button on these things. It's just a communication device that allows the president to talk to the National Command Authority. So they're very accurate there. I like that quite a bit. Usually in the briefcase, there's the phone. There's an options book, a nuclear attack options book that they can flip through in case they need to remember what the codes are, like what type of strike plan they're going to do. And there's also usually a line of succession document and a list of sites for them to go to, continuity of government sites. They mention in the movie and in the book that it takes 1 minute from when the order is given before missiles are in the air. They may not have known that at the time, but it's actually closer to 4-5 minutes between there. Usually it's considered to be 4 minutes, which is important when you're talking about a 30-minute window from when missiles are launched to when they land in the United States from Russia. It's shorter if they're subs on the coastline of the United States. 30 minutes. So the difference between 1 minute and 4 minutes is really a big deal when it takes 15 minutes to confirm there's an incoming strike. You have to wake the president up if it's nighttime. Yeah. You have to brief the president, and they have 5 minutes to decide and run through this process.
Wow. Takes me longer to decide what to have for lunch.
Takes me longer to wake up.
Well, yeah.
1 minute. They keep saying 1 minute over and over again. It's closer to 4, but that is something that gets brought up quite a lot. It was brought up in the presidential debates between Hillary and Trump. They brought up the fact that it takes 4 minutes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting. And once the order is given, can it be pulled back? Do you, let's say you're 3 minutes in, can you say abort the strike?
Yes.
Okay.
You can do that until the keys are turned.
Gotcha.
Once the keys are turned for a missile silo, there's nothing you can do.
Okay. No, that gives me a little bit more comfort. Maybe I'll sleep a little bit more at night that there's an extra 3 minutes that you can decide to call it off.
The scene was filmed in kind of interesting, an actual bunker, but in Canada. a place in Carp, Ontario, Canada. It was designed for the Canadian government, including the Prime Minister. That's where they would sit out a nuclear attack. That scene, not too bad. So if you want to see how this stuff works, that's a pretty good demonstration of it. The CIA director is there. Again, I'm not really sure why the CIA director is there. That's not really their job to be involved in the launch process.
Well, I think maybe you could say, because in the movie, I think he's like buddies with the president. They're like old friends. So maybe somehow he's like given some special, the president wanted to help his bro out, you know.
And it's probably good for the CIA director to know the process.
Sure.
But they would not be involved in the process.
Gotcha. Okay.
That CIA director says that they should drill against someone else other than Russia, because all they do is constantly Russia, Russia, Russia. President has this funny line about, if you know of anyone else that's got 27,000 nukes, then we'll drill against them. The CIA director says, well, I'm really worried about the guy with one nuke, which is quite foreshadowing, right?
And 27,000, is that? I know you're gonna have something to say about this number, Tim.
It's higher than it probably was in the
Okay.
2000s. It's unclear when this movie is supposed to have taken place. It's probably meant to be taking place during the Bush years, because there's a reference in one of the speeches to Clinton. So in the early 2000s, Russia, according to the Nuclear Notebook, which is a great resource people can use, Hans Christensen and Robert Norris, two great nuke scholars, put this thing together. It's closer to about 8,000 strategic weapons that the Russians had and 4,000 tactical nuclear weapons in the early 2000s.
Okay.
They might be counting weapons that Russia had that were in line for dismantlement. All of that process, which some of them could have been recalled and used again. They're like weapons in storage. Some of them are broken. Some of them are taken off the line for any number of reasons. But sure, 27,000. That's pretty high, but
Yeah, they just rounded up to the nearest 27,000.
well, I wonder because it's on the poster. The movie poster is 27,000 nuclear weapons in the world. One of them has gone missing. That's the tagline of the movie.
Gotcha.
So this movie version of Russia, it's a weakened country with an aged leader, very old, economic problems at home, violence in Chechnya, and way too many nukes. That's kind of where we are.
And this is how we get Jack Ryan in, right? Because I think he's with his analyst buddies in the CIA, and they're kind of lower. It's like a lower level office. They're really wonky. They're watching TV and commenting, I think, on the Russian leader's like diet and whether his coat fits. And
yeah, they're an open cube concept, open office concept.
Yeah,
right,
exactly.
So they can talk to
ahead
each other.
of its time. But no, I thought it was interesting because I mean, where you see Jack Ryan go, the first introduction to him is really this lower level analyst. He's digging into this minutia, and he's kind of on the lower decks of the CIA, so to speak.
Yeah, he seems to be a Russia expert. He doesn't know a lot about everything, but his specialty is Russia, which reminds me of George Kennan, who was a State Department official who was a huge Russia expert during a time where a lot of people who were considered Russia experts were considered communists. Why would he be focused on Russia? Be concerned about bigger things like war fighting or international relations writ large or political things, but George Kennan was a Russia expert, a regional expert, and he wrote a very famous article in Foreign Affairs, which is a magazine published by the Council on Foreign Relations. I used to work there, so Foreign Affairs, I still get the issues every month. This article is called The Sources of Soviet Conduct, where he outlines why Russia could not be bargained with. It needed to be contained. It will continually, because of insecurity, want to take over more and more of its peripheral non-communist places. You have to stop it. And that formed the entire Cold War U.S. strategy against Russia. Because they were wondering, what do you do? Do you appease Russia? Do you attack Russia? George Kennan, who wrote the article under the pseudonym X, because it wasn't official State Department policy at the time. People in the know knew he wrote it, but it was not public for a long time. Just an example of someone who's a Russia expert who kind of shaped Cold War strategy against Russia. And that didn't come from the president or the president's advisors. It came from a State Department, Russia expert.
John, why don't you maybe introduce the villains here, because we get the first glimpse.
Yeah, so the bad guys seem to be a sort of collection of European or maybe global neo-fascist. The initial scene that we see with them is the head of this group, who's an Austrian industrialist, giving a speech about how Europe has been treated as the child in the relationship between with the US or in relationship with Russia. He's sort of venting his spleen about this and saying, it's time that we took on a greater role in the world. The things that he's saying are not necessarily overtly fascist or conforming to a National Socialist agenda, but you get that kind of dolly shot around the podium to reveal his gold watch on the podium, and inscribed on the back of the watch is a swastika. So it's quite subtly pointed out that, here's a man who's talking about Europe taking on a greater role, being disenfranchised with the kind of bipolar arrangement of superpowers, and footnote, he's also a huge Nazi, and it just gives you that sense. It made me think he probably keeps that watch on when he goes like swimming, or he has to check his. Imagine going through an airport and you're gonna have to take your watch off. Oh dear.
Yeah, yeah. This is pre 9/11, so you have to take all that stuff off at the TSA. At least he's not blaming immigrants. I think if this movie was done today, that would be what it is.
Yeah,
yeah. It's a little different. I know you have to find the shades here.
That's fair.
But yeah, so that's who we start to introduce. Like this guy, we don't know what his point is in terms of the story, but I don't like him.
Yeah,
I already don't like him. So let's cut back to the desert. Gabe, why don't you handle this one?
So remember that bomb we talked about from 1973? Well, it's back.
Okay.
Yeah, there's some dudes out in the desert. I guess looking for treasure. They had their metal detectors out, and they came across the bomb from the plane that got shot down. They don't know what it is. They say, oh, this looks like a bomb. One of the guys says, oh, this is crap. Let's just get out of here. And the other one's like touching it, and he puts his hand inside the panel and says, oh, it's warm. Like, what could that mean? And, we all know that this is the nuke, and I guess the idea is that they really have no clue what this is. They want to sell this for money, but they don't know what they've come across.
And plutonium is warm to the touch because it's undergoing spontaneous fission. You can hold it, and it's not like searing, but it's warm.
Well, there was that line. Later in the movie they show these nuclear technicians, and the one takes out the plutonium sphere, and he's like, the warmth of plutonium, like plutonium decay. It's
Well, I don't know. I've never touched a nuclear bomb before in my life, but I imagine that the warmth does not come through all of the metal casing and the sphere, the other bomb parts, the conventional explosives that are around the core. And it's noticeably different than the desert, right? Like, yeah, the bomb's hot. It's in the desert.
Right.
But anyway, so I think it was at nighttime. Maybe that's why.
Yeah, maybe.
Then we cut to President Zorkin, who was the old-aged leader, and he's talking about fake news and why people are talking that his health is not so good. He's very robust for his age, and then just like collapses due to poor health.
And this is how we get Jack Ryan into the game, really, because I think through this it comes out that there's a scene Jack Ryan's with his girlfriend Kathy, and we talked about this before. This is where this is maybe where they lost some stars on Rotten Tomatoes. Tom Clancy's not great at writing, pillow talk. He should stick to.
I don't know. Did he write this movie?
I imagine maybe not. Yeah,
because in the book Jack Ryan is like married.
Yeah, sure.
He's accused of having an affair. Like he's at that point of his relationship already.
They're kind of cuddling, and he gets a call and says, "I got to run." She's like, well, what does a historian have to do? So clearly he's been lying to her. He's been covering up his job. But I guess, he gets called in because they're like, oh, you wrote this paper. This guy that you thought was going to be next to be the leader of Russia, Alexander Nemerov, he's actually the latest guy. And we need you to come to a briefing right away. And I mean, really, you have this lower level guy, Jack Ryan, and the CIA director basically grabs him. It's like the top dude saying, I need you for a briefing now, on Capitol Hill right away.
He's not dressed for it?
Yeah, no, he doesn't have a tie, so they have to steal a jacket from somebody, and William Cabot is briefing him along the way, saying
CIA director, yeah.
Yeah, saying don't say anything stupid, just talk when you need to, blah blah blah. They finally get into this briefing, which it's like a super briefing room. It's not like a traditional congressional hearing or Senate hearing, but it's in this like glass case that becomes opaque when everyone walks in, and there's like no sound leaking. So that this is like the top level.
Now, this is outside of my area of expertise, but there are places called SCIFs, Secure Departmental Information Facility. That's not what it is, but something along those lines, where there are facilities like this where you're allowed to read and receive briefings on classified information.
Okay.
Congress has one. The White House has a couple different places where you can do this.
Yeah. No. It was cool. And during the briefing, the CIA director, William Cabot, he's very calm and composed. Jack Ryan's kind of sitting in the back trying to like whisper to him, and he kind of says, you speak when you're told to speak.
Yeah. Sir,
Nemerov's just saying what he needs to say to get the hardliners off his back. If we leave him alone, Russia will stabilize. If we push him, all bets are over.
When I asked for your advice, I didn't mean that you should actually speak.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Cabot.
I think the scene ends with, like, welcome to the CIA sport, because he knows about some detail of his personal life.
Yeah,
and
he knows about Kathy.
Yeah, he knows about Kathy. So it's kind of, and this is like through the movie. There, we'll get to that at the end, but
It's the start of a theme, isn't it? I
Yeah.
thought this film could equally have been called The Perpetual Sexual Frustration of Ben Affleck. Because it's just every time something is about to kick off, he's either in bed or in some other slightly compromising, but hopefully getting more compromising situation, and it's dragged away by the CIA for more important stuff.
Yeah, the big thing is that Congress thinks that the new president is a hardliner who will invade Chechnya and will be a problem for the United States. Jack Ryan and CIA Director Cabot do not think that that's the case. They think this guy he's going to say tough things because he's at a vulnerable position internally and domestically, but he's not like going to be a problem unless we make him a problem.
yeah.
So let's cut back to a lot of cuts, a lot of fast changing scenes.
Yeah.
We'll cut back to a tent where there's an arms dealer from South Africa who discovers the bomb. I guess they must have made a phone call because he's originally, I think this guy is based in Damascus, Syria. So
this South African, he's part of this neo-fascist group.
I think he's just a dude. He's an arms dealer guy.
Okay, so he's just
So I'm sure. So he realized it's a nuke. He's watched a movie or two. He's a podcast listener. He realized this is a nuke. And he says to the scrap dealer, "It's like, oh, this is junk. It doesn't even work. But $400. How about that?"
And like dumb negotiators, the other guys are like, okay, yeah.
Well, $400. Probably a big deal.
A real point of realism. The guys are, I think they're in the book at least, they're Druze farmers. So if they're used to scratching around in the desert, pulling stuff out and getting a good rate for it, the chance of him just nodding along and oh yeah, thanks very much, $400, wow, yeah.
The South African arms dealer says there was a lot of fighting in '73, right? Do you remember about an airplane, an A4 that went down? And they're like, yeah, it was shot down. It was a really big deal. We all knew about this story, which makes sense. That could have been something that people would have heard about.
Yeah.
And then he realizes, oh, I've heard a story about a nuclear weapon that went missing.
Yeah, right.
This is what this is. The South African arms dealer is really good because at some point the farmer mentions that he lost his son in the fighting, and the arms dealer is like, "This is junk, but in honor of your son, I will give you $400."
Right. Yeah.
Oh, that is, this guy's a bad guy. So the guy goes back, the arms dealer, he goes on Craigslist or something, and I think
he's on the dark web.
He's on the dark web. He emails the guy, the turns out to be the Austrian industrialist, and says, "I found what you were looking for. It's an Israeli-made Mark 12 fission bomb, and I'll sell it to you for $50 million US." And the guys, you can see I think the Austrian's on the other end, and he's like smoking a cigarette, drinking port. I don't know what he's drinking.
Yeah. Pure grain alcohol and rainwater.
Exactly. And he agrees. So a little bit here, the Mark 12 or B-12 is a US-made nuclear weapon. It was retired in the late 1950s. So it's kind of interesting to see that it's involved in fighting later. I think that it's implied that the US gave Israel the bomb design, or at least the plutonium. It's a US bomb. It's dropped by an airplane. It's a gravity bomb. It will go off when it reaches a certain altitude. That's kind of how the trigger will work on that. It's very light. That's a particularly interesting component to that history because it was one of the first warhead designs that used a reflector around the plutonium core, so you didn't need as much plutonium, because the way it would work is when you start to have fission, the neutrons will try to, mostly empty space, they're going to try to escape. So you need lots of plutonium in a very tight place so that there's no way to escape. But a reflector means that those neutrons will bounce back and then have a more likely
increase
chance of
the
hitting.
probability of hitting. Yeah.
So using this reflector, though, it's an incredibly light bomb relative to the other ones. It had a yield of either 12 or 14 kilotons, depending on how you designed it. It was made by Los Alamos National Lab. Its code name was Brock, B-R-O-K. Don't know what that means, but it's probably a random code name. It weighed about 1,200 pounds or 545 kilograms, about 12 feet long, 22 inches in diameter. So kind of a elongated bomb, not the prop that they made for the movie.
Yeah, the movie was like short and fat almost. Yeah.
And the funny thing about that is when they made this prop, they couldn't actually load it onto the A4 that they had access to. it was too heavy, so they had to CGI in the bomb while the plane was flying.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So this is like 2000s era CGI. So they had to matte paint the CGI onto not matte paint, but they had to paint on the CGI for the bomb when it was flying.
That's interesting.
Because it was too big for the actual plane who could carry a real Mark 12. People's envision of like what a nuclear bomb looks like, it probably is like a Fat Man bomb, and not an elongated missile, which just looks like a missile, right? Or a dropped bomb or something.
So I think the next part of the movie I found super interesting. Actually, this is all about an inspection, a nuclear inspection in Russia. And I guess earlier in the movie, William Cabot, the CIA director, says he wants to go personally, and I guess because of Jack Ryan's influence, he brings him along. So there's a scene of them on an airplane. And Jack Ryan has to call his girlfriend from the plane to cancel their dinner date. And there's this great scene. William Cabot says, tell her who you work for. Tell her what you're doing. He's like,
Hello, Kathy. I can't make it.
Where are you going?
I can't tell you that.
Jack, tell her where you're going. In fact, tell her who you work for. She'll be impressed.
I work for the CIA, and the director asked me at the last minute to come with him to Russia to do a nuclear arms inspection.
That is so lame.
Hello?
like hangs up. She's like, that's lame. Like, screw
Just
you.
another
like,
opportunity for the CIA to screw over his relationship.
there you go. Yeah, there's strike two.
I thought that was really funny.
But no, so this was, and did they mention the treaty that this inspection happens under?
START,
Okay.
START.
Which I think you've talked about on the podcast.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah.
So this is the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So it's like an ATM machine, automated teller machine, in the sense that the last word is also the last letter of the abbreviation. It was signed in 1991 after the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union has collapsed. What this led to was huge reductions, 80% reductions in the number of nuclear weapons in the world. And as part of that, there were very intrusive and continual inspections that either side could do to verify that the bombs were actually being dismantled, that the missiles were being dismantled. START 1 allowed for 28 on-site inspections per year, so quite a number of inspections. Some of them, according to a really good summary by the Nuclear Threat Initiative, a think tank here in DC, some of those inspections are called short notice. We call you and we're going to be there in 2 days, kind of thing. So that you can't hide information that fast. Tests about the baseline data, data updates, reentry vehicle tests, things like that. But there are also planned ones that are on a more regular schedule. And these are things like verification of the technical data that's being shared between the countries about their bombs, and the right to observe the elimination of missiles and other facilities, things like that, which is what they're on here. A little bit of history. In the first 7 years of this treaty, when these reductions were taking place, the U.S. conducted 335 inspections, and Russia did 243. There were data exchanges about the types of weapons, the locations, their movements. All this stuff was shared, which was a really incredible asset for the military, because otherwise the military has to do worst-case planning. We don't know how many you have. We don't know where there are. We need more weapons so that we can account for errors in our intelligence. But if this information is shared and verified, they can have significant reductions on their own side. That's kind of why arms control is so valuable as a tool. If you can verify it, it's pretty powerful stuff. This treaty expired in 2009 and was replaced by the New START treaty.
A new start.
Yeah, a new start.
Would the CIA typically be, because this is like, that's what was a weird thing to me. The CIA director, the top guy at the CIA, is personally going on this inspection. Is that something you would expect?
No. I think it makes sense in the movie once the president is, like, the Russian president dies and there's a new president, because I can see a world where the CIA would be sending someone to talk to that person, to be like, all right, cause they're high level, they have the trust of the president, right? They're friends. But that was planned. This trip was planned with the CIA director before the Russian president died.
It kind of makes sense once they get in, and he says, we sent however many people it was to try and get in this place, and loads of them died, and I personally sent, I think he says I sent 4 or something. Mm-hmm. And I kind of got the impression that right, okay, so that's why he's here, is because he wants to come and see for himself and kind of be present and have that kind of moment. But maybe it's just a point that's in there for realism. It doesn't seem to drive the plot on. I think most people would have picked up on, why is the CIA director there? Perhaps they would, but
the CIA is a spy agency. You don't want to send a spy agency as a sign of trust building between two countries. You send the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. It's within the Department of Defense in the U.S. They form the inspection teams, and these are a mix of military and a mix of civilian people who are experts in these topics. It used to be called the On-Site Inspection Agency before START was created. And Stitcher would also do inspections in Russia. They would also escort Russian inspectors when they would come to the United States. They weren't always friendly. You know, one of the jokes in this movie is that the Russians are like leery of the U.S. being in those rooms with the nuclear weapons. And one of the guys who was a former deputy director at DITRA, Jim Leahy, said that there was a level of uncertainty between the U.S. and Russia during those early days of START. Our Russian counterparts were used to working with us, but in many instances, the military and civilian support personnel at Russia START sites had never seen or worked with Americans. Most of them were suspicious, some were curious, others were indifferent. All they knew about Americans, good or bad, came from movies and or what they read in their propaganda newspapers. So our teams had to keep that in mind during the initial inspections. Right. So there was a sense of trust they had to build, and it probably wouldn't have made that trust process easy if you started to send in the CIA.
Yeah, right. Well, for better or for worse, they're there. I guess before going to the actual arms site, they do a quick stop at the in Moscow to meet with the new Russian president. There's this kind of scene where the Russian president getting his portrait, his prom photos taken, and he kind of indicates that he knows Jack Ryan, and they have like a little exchange where the Russian president speaking Russian, and then Jack Ryan speaks Russian back and says, "Oh, I know you speak English," and they laugh.
You must be the Dr. Ryan who has done such interesting research on me.
Nie odylejtесь. My довольно много знаем.
You should not be surprised by this. We know quite a bit.
Например, вы написали, что в институте я был бабник.
For instance, we know how wrong you were in your report that I had many girlfriends in college.
На самом деле, после того, как я встретил свою жену на третьем курсе,
I met my wife in my third year and have not looked at another woman since.
I was referring to the first 2 years. Sir. I like you. Well, in that case, so do I.
Which is a funny line.
Yeah, that was quite a nice way to sort of build a bit of rapport between the two characters, I guess. So
that's very important for later. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, it was quite funny, wasn't it? You know, I think he says I met my wife at college, and I've not looked at another woman since. And there's kind of a beat, and then you know, Jack Ryan responds in Russian, effectively calling him out and saying, you know, where you got really good grades in English, so kind of shall we cut through the BS here and get down to brass tacks. And you can kind of see, Cabot looking a bit nervous until the president does the classic bad sort of pseudo bad guy thing of oh, I like him, he's a strong guy, kind of friendly punch on the arm sort of thing, like, all right, yeah, everything's cool, everything's defused, that's brilliant.
And Jack Ryan then earns a little bit of trust and respect of the CIA director as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So the team then goes to the nuclear inspection site where they're dismantling weapons. They call this Artemis 16. So the tour guide says this is where the birthplace of the Russian nuclear weapon. So I will just go a little bit of detail here because this is a real site. It was established in April of 1946. Its mission was to design and produce nuclear explosive test devices, as well as to produce a deliverable bomb. And Russia, their first weapon, their atomic weapon, and their hydrogen bomb were designed there. This was really referred to as the Russian Los Alamos. And funny enough, after the end of the Cold War, those two cities, Artemis 16 and Los Alamos, became official sister cities.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. In 1993. You know, because there's exchanges, scientists like to talk to each other. Even during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union had lots of experiments together. Scientists tend to want to work together for the purposes of science and not always considered each other like antagonists. One of the kind of interesting things about this place as well, it was renamed since 1995. It had another name, but it became Sarov, S-A-R-O-V. It's no longer called Artemis 16, but maybe the people who work there, old habits die hard kind of thing. We see scenes of missile warheads being dismantled and taken apart. This is true. Artemis 16 was one of 4 what are called serial production facilities in Russia, where you assemble and disassemble nuclear weapons. Around the year 2000 is when those there was only 4 of those, and Artemis was one of them. Its specialty was to manufacture, refurbish, and dismantle the warhead physics package. You mentioned earlier that the CIA director says that he tried to get into this site with spies before, but they were all died. Westerners, though, did visit Arzamaz in October of 1990. There were a lot of joint experiments and engagements since then, so it wasn't the first time that anyone had gotten there, but he probably is meaning a spy who would work there and gain intel, and they caught the person and killed him, all that stuff. I think the most important thing here is that Jack Ryan was looking at the manifest, and he says that,
According to this, there are 17 senior scientists on duty today. I only count 14.
there's 3 scientists missing that are supposed to be there. There's an old hand Russian guy they joke that he's been around since the Cold War. He knows where all the bodies are buried. He probably buried some of them himself. And he has a document that says, oh, one of them is out sick. The other one
on vacation. And the third one died in a car crash. And yeah, actually, it's a little suspicious. When they're on the plane ride home, Jack Ryan's talking to the CIA director, and he's like, nah, they have no idea where these dudes are. They've gone rogue, and we don't know where they are. So
we also see a scene where the arms dealer is putting the weapon on a cargo container going somewhere, and he's smiling. So the bomb is in movement. It's going somewhere.
Does quite a lot of smirking, doesn't he? The arms dealer.
Lots of smirking.
Got a pretty good smirk.
He's got a good leer.
Yeah, exactly.
A good smirk.
So the pieces are kind of coming together. We have, the bomb's been now identified and, is moving somewhere. We know that there are these missing scientists. We know that Jack Ryan's on the trail. So things are starting to come together here, building up the plot a little bit. I thought it was... this is a nice time where they bring in John Clark, one of my favorite parts of this movie, because he's such a badass dude.
Played by Liv Schreiber.
Yep. And basically, he's like the one of the field guys from the Tom Clancy universe. And I guess in this movie, he gets moved to a desk job. William Cabot, the CIA director, says to him, hey, I need you to get back out there,
3 Russian scientists are missing. I need to know where they are.
Put on your jersey one more time. You need to go out and find out what's going on here. Where are these scientists?
And he doesn't want to because he knows this is wet work. He knows there's probably going to be some killing involved. Yeah.
Quite funny how Cabot is basically giving away all of his sources to this junior analyst. Like you said, on the jet, they're coming back across from Russia. And he says, these are the 3 guys, and we know they weren't where they. The story doesn't add up. Jack Ryan says, I'm dying to know I'm dying to ask you how you know that. And instead of just sort of raising an eyebrow and going back to his business, the director of the CIA says to a guy who, I'm assuming he's been vetted, but certainly, this has got to be like really high level stuff. Not only says, oh, well, no, actually, I've got a guy and he's at the top level of the Russian government. This is his code name. He turns the laptop around and says, look, here's my message history, just in case you don't believe me.
Well, doesn't he say something too, like, he shares stuff with me, I share stuff with him?
I share stuff with him.
Isn't that treason? Like, you're not supposed to be doing that.
Yeah.
That all goes, that just like, oh, right, okay. What in-flight movie shall we watch? It doesn't seem to get a mention, but it is important later on. So.
And this guy is codenamed Spinnaker.
Oh yeah,
right. Spinnaker as
in the front sail on a sailboat. Yeah.
Oh.
Whenever you see a sailboat with that big sail in the front, that you can put on, that's a Spinnaker.
Because he goes where the wind goes.
I guess so.
Yeah. Interesting. I'll say here that I'd love another thing about this movie is that there isn't just one missing rogue scientist who can do it all. Like in Mission Impossible Fallout, where there's like one Norwegian scientist who knows everything you need to do. You give him some nuclear material, he can make a bomb. Because that's not really how it works. Most people have specialties. This information is purposely compartmentalized, so not everyone learns how to do everything. Someone, I'm sure you could learn it if you wanted to, but it's hard. There are 3 missing scientists that each have different specialties. One knows things about detonation, so probably conventional explosives. One knows about the bomb physics package, the plutonium package, and another one is math, right? There's some reference to he does the calculations. I love the fact that there are 3 scientists that split this up, because in most movies it's just one.
Yeah, just one dude who knows
and this is really the worry, is that these scientists would get pulled away, what's called brain drain, when they no longer have high-paying jobs because the Soviet Union collapsed. There was a number of initiatives the United States did to stop that from happening, giving them civilian jobs, trying to find ways for them to be able to continue to have good incomes. There was this initiative called the Nuclear Cities Initiative in the late 90s that was trying to transform these cities like Arzamat 16 into civilian research, engineering, manufacturing centers of excellence, so that they would continue to exist instead of just like collapse and then go start working for Libya or Syria or North Korea or something.
Right.
One of the things I was wondering was why, if these scientists were leaving, why they maybe didn't steal plutonium or a working bomb from their facility. Maybe because it was guarded really well or something, but this was really a concern because Russian press in March of 1993 reported that 11 kilograms of uranium-238 were stolen from Arzamat 16 Nuclear Research and Development Center. Never confirmed, but the Russian reports were about that this was happening. So I was wondering why, in this world, if this guy, this South African arms dealer, has these guys on speed dial, why he didn't just ask them to steal plutonium like in their pockets or something.
Maybe it was just fake news, so yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
But something interesting.
It's nice that they went to the effort to get, you know, representative locations and to really go into, because there's, I mean, for most people, this level of detail is the sort of thing that you wouldn't get in a film that has this kind of action, like one or two main characters. I think it's really cool that they went to the detail, not only of finding, you know, what the name was, but inserting all these details and getting a even down to the location. Whether when they go there, it's all, you know, it's really snowy, and I think the film is set in like February, not far from Moscow, so it's all pretty realistic stuff. I like that.
There is a category of nuke movies that are based on like a book or a story. So The Peacemaker was originally, it's based on a book largely around this one person's story, Jessica Stern, who was a White House staffer that dealt with loose nuclear material, and it was written into a book, and then it got turned into the movie. I think that was called 1 Point Safe. And then you have movies like this that are based on Tom Clancy books, who goes through and does lots of research on things. And because that was what he was. He was an historian who had affiliation with the Naval War College. And then you have other movies like Mission Impossible, which just are written by people who aren't nuke experts, who are interested more in like the stunts and things, and the nukes are more of like a MacGuffin for it. And you have those different kinds of movies, and it's fun. I like both. It's refreshing to have a film where it's underscored by all of these other things.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah. All right, so
you know, the tensions get now ratcheted up another notch. We have this scene where, to smooth things over with his girlfriend, Jack Ryan takes his girlfriend to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. He gets a ticket from the CIA director. Actually, it was John Clark's ticket, who now has been sent over. So the CIA director's ruining everybody's life. And
also, I don't know why John Clark would have a ticket.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
but whatever, it's not important.
So, and in the drinking game of the CIA ruins Jack Ryan's dating life, sure enough. During the middle of the Correspondents' Dinner, everyone's cell phones start going off. People, I guess, are too rude to put them on silent or vibrate.
Well, pagers.
And, there's pagers as well. And clearly there's some crisis, there's some incident. The president gets called away, and you see everyone just kind of taking off to go to their posts.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of when, in 2011, Barack Obama was giving the national correspondence. So usually it's the president. Hasn't happened the last couple of years, but usually the president will give a little bit of a comedy speech where he jokes with the media, and at that point President Obama was making fun of Trump, like it was all in the middle of the birth certificate thing, so he was cracking jokes. And just earlier that day, he had given the order to do the raid on Osama bin Laden, but he was like keeping calm, cool during this emergency situation. Wild.
Stone Cold Fox, Stone Cold Killer. So John, what's called everybody away? Why have they had to cut the dinner short?
Yeah, so it turns out that they've all been called away because there's a developing situation in Chechnya, where the Russians have. I think the briefing that the president has in the situation room is there's been a massive artillery attack on Grozny. Using something called a Novichok binary nerve agent, which fans of current affairs in the UK might be familiar with. You know, it's the biggest. I think they say it's the most devastating or the biggest chemical weapons attack in history. And at that point, I wound the film back to see what the figure was, so I could compare it. But they just say, it's the death toll is 80%, and it's obviously this horrific attack. They reference everybody, men, women, children, all being caught up in this thing, and there is a real appetite in the room to do something to punish the Russians for doing this, and that leads into a discussion about what to do, but also it brings in Jack Ryan because he sat in the corner behind Cabot as the senior staff are deciding not so much was it Russia, but because Russia really at this point, certainly as far as we're concerned in the information we've been given in the film, are the only ones with skin in the game in Chechnya. It's like, right, what are we going to do? How are we going to punish the Russians? And they talk about, off the top of my head, I think they talk about getting Chechnya diplomatic recognition as a sovereign state, but not full diplomatic recognition, and then get them to call in peacekeepers, and the Americans will send the peacekeepers. It struck me that there might need to be some discussion about the finer points of that detail, maybe in the UN, but they seem happy with that plan. And then Jack Ryan, I think they ask him for his take on what this is all about, and he's meant to be this Russia expert and an analyst, but he decides to lead with his opinion rather than backing it really up with any fact. Jack Ryan decides that he is so passionately disagreeing with this course of action, he decides to stand up and again lead with his opinion and say, what if he didn't order the attack? The president says, well, are you spitballing? Like, what evidence do you have to back this up? And he says, I would bet he didn't do it. Which is maybe the sort of evidence that more recent presidents are used to dealing with, but it doesn't go down too well in the room. The president says, "Yeah, senior staff remain behind. Everyone else get out, and we're gonna carry on talking about the nuts and bolts of this thing."
Yeah, and unfortunately for Jack Ryan, immediately on television, the Russian president says, "Yeah, I did it. Yeah, I ordered it, no problem."
But in secret.
In an elevator, talking to the guy who knows where all the bodies are buried, dude.
Yeah, and I guess it's revealed in that conversation in Moscow that there were some unhappy old communist generals that went rogue and basically launched this attack. So Jack Ryan was right, but everyone thinks he was wrong.
And the president from Russia cannot look like he is not in control of his military.
Exactly.
So what do they say? It's better to look like an aggressor than weak.
Yeah. There's this short scene where there's this group of all the neo-fascists. They're having like a lunch, an evil lunch together, and there's this one guy who tries to back out of the plan, and they actually end up like murdering him.
It was a French, right?
Yeah, he was I think either French or Swiss, something like that. And no, I think this scene was just to kind of show that these are really bad guys, but it introduces some of these other characters, like a Russian who's going to come in later in the movie, and there's this big German muscle guy who
Herr Heft.
Herr Heft. Great name.
Great, yeah.
It's like in Star Wars where the large guy who's a pilot, his name is Porkins. Herr Heft. He's the muscle.
It's very Bond-esque, isn't it? Like we have to sit through this poor French or Swiss guy explaining why he's going to leave, and there's this gigantic blonde German in the background wielding, his muscles everywhere. It's like, oh, mate, come on, read the room.
Yeah, and he immediately gets killed. Yeah, this subplot of like right-wing political movements, it was certainly happening in the early 2000s, and it's, you can see a lot of it happening now in Europe and in the United States for sure. It's kind of scarier. It added an additional level of analysis and I guess relevancy for some of all fears.
I think it is worth a rewatch, just in the current times for that reason. In addition to this group, they bring in another accomplice. There's this guy in Baltimore who works at the docks. I guess he's kind of disgruntled. There's some conversation as with the colleague indicates he may have washed out of the Navy, and he gets an email saying the day has come. So clearly now they have some contact here stateside who's going to help do whatever it is, and he's in Baltimore.
I think he signs, either in that scene or later, he signs for the package, the bomb cargo.
Yeah, so that's where the bomb was going, basically. It's coming to Baltimore, but the CIA doesn't know it yet, so...
Nope, all the CIA and the U.S. knows is that the Russians, they haven't moved their tanks around too much, because I think there's this discussion amongst the CIA analysts that if they were to move the tanks, they know that the only way that the United States could stop that, because the Russians have so many tanks, is with tactical nuclear weapons, and the Russians wouldn't want that to happen. And that is a sign to Jack Ryan, at least, that the Russians didn't do the attack, because otherwise they would have started to push this a little bit more. And then we see John Clark, who's now in the field. He's going around. Yeah. He tricks an old lady into revealing the location of her son, who's one of the Russian scientists. And she says that he's in Ukraine helping to build a bomb. This information gets brought up the chain, and the CIA director, who's kind of considered to be a hero of the movie, right?
Yeah.
We all like Morgan Freeman. I'm looking at my Shawshank Redemption poster over here with his name on it. He makes a mistake. He interprets the intelligence as Russia is building a secret bomb it can use in Chechnya that doesn't have Russian fingerprints on it.
Yeah, but actually, as we know, and John Clark, he goes to the site and he's spying on the South African guy that they're having, the arms dealer, saying that we have these scientists working on it. We have a bomb basically, and so it's clear that there's some disconnect in information there, that it's really this neo-Nazi group, but the CIA thinks it's the Russians.
And I like this scene a lot. They're in the bomb-making warehouse. There's tarp, plastic around, plastic sheeting, so that it's somewhat of a secure room. I don't know, something. But there you can see them taking the bomb, the Israeli Mark 12 bomb, apart. You see soccer ball patterned ball with various pieces,
like hexagons coming out,
yeah, it's like they're playing Catan or something, like a 3D version of Catan, and they pull it apart. One of the scientists takes the bomb out. He says it's warm to the touch, and then gives it to someone else, and then goes for a cigarette, right? Like, there's a joke about how you shouldn't do that. This is actually pretty interesting because that's a level of detail that I really appreciated. So plutonium bombs have to be implosion devices, meaning you take a sphere of plutonium, which let's say is around the size of a softball. Using conventional explosives, that's those different hexagon shapes, they're very specially designed and they have to squish the plutonium to the size of like a golf ball. And then instantly during that moment, inject a neutron source. And that's what starts the supercritical reaction.
Hey, that's the name of the podcast.
That has to happen. They actually show that in the film, which is pretty cool. I don't know why. Maybe the conventional explosives have degraded in the desert, so they need to put them into a new set of conventional explosives.
Well, and I think they also needed to fit into this. They're putting it into this vending machine. There's like a cigarette vending machine in the back, and you kind of learn it later, but they're basically trying to fit this big cylinder bomb into a square vending machine, so maybe that's what they were doing.
Yeah, so I guess the bomb has not left that area yet. That's right.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's super interesting with this is you can see they take the hemisphere cover off of the plutonium, which is probably the reflector or the tamper, which hold everything together for a little bit longer. It's perfectly safe to touch the plutonium. Plutonium emits alpha particles as part of its spontaneous fission. Those are blocked by skin. You would probably wear gloves. Really, plutonium is most dangerous when it gets high levels of fission. That's when it gets really dirty and dangerous, but also when you inhale dust particles. That can get into your lungs and cause really bad, nasty stuff because it will directly affect your organs. And I loved also the vending machine joke because during this lunch we talked about earlier with the various fascists there's a joke that the Austrian industrialist makes that says, when he takes out a cigarette, he goes, "I've been told that these things can kill you." Remember that, because that joke gets brought up later on. Yeah. But yeah, so John Clark sees that these activities are happening, that we have a bomb, and now we're in a dangerous situation here. The CIA director interrupts another romantic evening.
Oh my god, here we go again.
Yep. He sends Jack Ryan, takes away his date night and brings him to an airfield and says, "You're going to go with John Clark to Ukraine so that you can find out more what's going on."
Well, and John, this is kind of what we talked about before, that he's this desk guy, but now he's actually going to go into the field, right?
Yeah. The real habit of doing that, I suppose, in intelligence agencies is take the analyst out of the guy who didn't remember his tie and stick him on a super critical mission, right behind enemy lines.
I don't go on the missions. I just write reports.
So write a report about it.
I'm an analyst.
I'm not trained for this.
I guess they sends Jack Ryan because it's an unsanctioned mission, and he thinks he can trust Jack Ryan to not spill the beans.
Yeah, right.
Disposable. I think Morgan Freeman's after his girlfriend. It's the only possible explanation.
Yep.
He does seem really obsessed getting information. I was always asking him, "How's your girlfriend doing? Has she left you yet?"
Oh no.
I love this scene because John Clark's so casual about it. I think Jack Ryan's I can't go on this mission, and John's like, "It's not a mission, it's a recce." And they're on this boat going to the site, and Jack Ryan's all scared, and John Clark's making small talk. "Oh, how was the correspondence dinner?" And he's all relaxed. But no,
yeah, and he gets John Clark gives him a gun at the last moment. I don't know why he doesn't have the gun earlier,
right,
but
exactly.
And he says, I'm not going to go in there. And he goes, no, you're going to guard my boat.
Yeah, exactly. They finally get to this site where they were building the bomb, and it looks like they're too late because John Clark goes in. He sees the nuclear scientists have apparently been killed. One of their bodies is being devoured by like wild dogs. He finds this dose meter that shows heavy radioactive exposure, and there's something spray painted black is heavy, large, and radioactive. And I think finally the light bulb goes off, and he's like, something big happened here, and we got to stop it.
The pace is starting to pick up. With the movie, we see the Austrian industrialist. He is doing like a YouTube video, probably his like online manifesto. He starts to talk about how fascism will spread quickly now because of the internet and global television. That during World War II, it was too hard to spread fascism, but now it's going to be easier. He has this interesting line where he says,
"They called Hitler crazy, but Hitler wasn't crazy. He was stupid. You don't fight Russia and America. You get Russia and America to fight each other and destroy each other."
So we're starting to see the outlines of his motivation.
Yeah,
what their plan is. The nuke is delivered to Baltimore. It's being disguised, as we mentioned earlier, not just a vending machine, but a cigarette vending machine, which is a funny little joke there. I wonder if the Austrian industrialist requested that it be a cigarette vending machine, right?
Yeah, maybe. This is like before. You don't see cigarette vending machines anymore, so I think this was a funny kind of like little...
So my wife looked this up. It was sometime in like 2004. The federal government in the United States passed a bill that says you cannot have cigarette vending machines in places where people under 18 are likely to be.
Okay.
So you can put them in casinos, strip clubs, things like that, but you can't put them at like sporting venues.
Also, I've been to many sporting events. I've never seen a vending machine there. I have to go to the stand and wait in line and spend, $30 for a beer.
Well, this looked like it was not where people would go to.
It was like in the bowels of the stadium.
I wonder whether it might be a cultural thing, because I went to Germany recently and there were cigarette vending machines on the street over there.
Really?
So maybe it's like, what can we put this bomb in that is going to be, something you would see every day. It's not going to attract any attention. I know, we'll use a cigarette vending machine and then send it to the States where they don't have them anymore.
I love the callback to the joke, cigarettes will kill you.
Yeah.
Because
right, exactly.
It's in a cigarette machine. When you start to see the camera pans to the cigarette vending machine, you clearly see, how in a vending machine you hit like A5 to get your chips. There's clearly A4 is on there.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, okay, now my brain is developing connections here. It's like math formulas are spinning around my head. A4, right? The A4 bomber that we had earlier, and on A4 is a pack of Camel cigarettes. So I'm wondering, A4, Camels, desert, where they found the bomb. Whew, there's something there, right?
Tim, I think you're being super critical.
That's fair. That's fair. Another fun connection, someone who's on our Facebook page, facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast, Gregory mentioned that it reminded him of Dr. Strangelove, because in that movie, they need a quarter to call the White House to tell them the attack is not real, that it's what's going on. So they have to shoot a Coca-Cola vending machine to get a quarter. And it's one of my favorite scenes in that movie, because the guy who's like there's a military like an MP or an army guy who's like thinks that this British guy is probably going to be, they don't know what's going on there. And he says, if you're wrong about this, you're going to have to answer to the Coca-Cola company. I thought that was really funny.
So it's unclear what this event is going to be. I think it's supposed to be the Super Bowl. It looks like it must be the Super Bowl is being held in Baltimore.
In the book, it's clearly the Super Bowl.
Okay.
They don't mention it, but it's in Baltimore, and the two teams are Chicago and Florida.
Chicago and Florida.
Whatever that means.
Can we also talk about what they show them sing the national anthem?
American football.
Sorry for our UK guest here. Can we talk about how when they're singing the national anthem, they're singing the second verse, or it's like this different lines. It's it's the second stanza where it's like, conquer we must, for our cause it is just. I noticed that, and I've always been obsessed with it, because I never heard that sung anywhere, and yet they choose to sing it in this movie, which is, I thought, a very interesting.
I didn't pick up any of that, because I was furiously reading notes about connections between refrigerators and vending machines.
No, look it up, because the second stanza The second stanza of the national anthem, the U.S. national anthem, it gets pretty like dark, and it gets like we're gonna like take over everything, and like we're look it up, and I wonder if that was used on purpose for some reason here.
That's interesting. So this is the part of the movie where there's a drum line happening because it's like sports and stuff, and it starts to really pick up the pace.
Yeah.
And I love this. You start to see flashes of people getting excited for the football that's happening.
And we got to mention important detail. Guess who's at the football game?
The president of the United States and all of his buddies,
and the CIA director, and all these other top guys. So yeah, it's like stakes are super high, and this is where Jack Ryan realizes what's coming together. He's feverishly trying to reach the CIA director while this game is going on.
Yep.
There's some cell phone interference. William Cabot can't really hear him, and finally it gets through, and Jack Ryan's saying the bomb is in Baltimore.
Yeah, Cabot. It's Ryan! Ball at the 22-yard line. What? The bomb is in play! What not? Baltimore! They're breaking out. What are you saying? Look, I'm losing you. I'll call you back from the Baltimore! Sir!
Everything then picks up. They're like, William Cabot says, we got to get out of here. They quickly evacuate the president, and then
you see a long shot of Baltimore, like from the air, from like the Goodyear blimp or something. And I love this. The music cuts out. It stays a little longer than you would expect, and you're constantly like on the edge, like what's gonna happen? What's gonna happen?
Well, all we know is the president has been taken off. That could mean anything. It could be ill, it could be injured. We have no...
Then it cuts to the hospital where Kathy works, because there's this big window. All of a sudden, flash. The window shatters, explodes into the hospital. Then we see another scene of a shockwave, dust rolling over the motorcade, knocking over telephone poles, flipping cars up like toys.
And this is the president's motorcade as he's being evacuated.
Absolutely. Then there's a helicopter scene where Jack Ryan's in a helicopter. He's the one trying to call the CIA director. The helicopter, you see the ground, the shockwave move out. The helicopter splits in two. You see wind going out with the shockwave, and then it stops for a second and then comes back in.
Sorry, pause. John, helicopter crash, realistic or not?
let's all take a moment for the heroic few minutes that the helicopter remained on screen.
I loved it. In your notes, you timed it out. I loved it.
Yeah. So the helicopter crash is an interesting one. So I'm not sure. Obviously these blast waves, they dissipate to a certain extent with distance from the hypocenter, but I don't know. So I don't know how far away the helicopter is, but the blast wave travels at the speed of sound. It's going to be dissipating. The mechanism by which the helicopter is ultimately brought down is the blast wave passes over it, and as it passes over it seems to knock the aircraft kind of sideways, and then when you get the blast or the whatever it is coming, the shockwave coming back the other way, it's almost like it's going to knock the aircraft back around, and it just takes the tail off the helicopter, which is, I've never flown a helicopter through a nuclear blast. I don't know anybody that has, but the tail, that particular part of the aircraft is very, very vulnerable to any kind of shock. There have been instances where the aircraft, where the main rotor has received a shock of some sort, where it's either been overloaded or something like that, and it's actually the tail that's come loose from the aircraft or has been damaged. So it's very, very vulnerable. So
is it an important part of the helicopter?
It depends how good you are, I guess, as a pilot. They very luckily in this case have such a skilled pilot on board that it barely makes any difference to the direction the helicopter's going in. For real, the tail rotor stops the helicopter from spinning around, and the rotor's going one way and the fuselage spinning the other. Once you remove that, you've got to do something about the fact that you've got all this torque being delivered through the transmission, and the only way really to deal with that, where you lose part of the airframe structure, is to cut the engines and try and ride the aircraft down in the best way that you can manage. And of course there's always alarms and a panicked sense in the cockpit, and then the aircraft hits the ground and it impacts like nose first into like a berm or a verge of some kind, and it kind of slightly crumples the nose, and then the whole helicopter rotates around and tumbles down, and the poor old pilot gets thrown out of the door. Jack Ryan manages to survive. But yeah, I just thought, wow, that's a pretty impressive crumple zone they've got on the front of that helicopter, because they're not the skin on these things is about the same thickness as a Coke can, and they're not designed. Helicopters are designed to crash, because if you look at a lot of action films, they're really good at it, but they're designed to crash like vertically with a rate of descent vertically straight down. All the seats collapse. There's all the shock absorption is in the vertical axis. If you just drive one into a berm, kind of asking for it, really.
So it's fair to say that the crash itself plausible if you had a really good pilot who could react almost instantly to the losing the tail rotor. Yeah. But the actual impact probably not. The impact
realistic. And again, I assume that the blast didn't do more damage. He may not have had any control over the direction the helicopter's going. It might literally just have been a case of shut the engines down and kind of hope for the best. That nose first impact and then all the rolling, almost certainly would have been a fire and a much worse outcome for poor old Jack Ryan. But fortunately, he's able to drag himself out of the wreckage and check on the pilot and then use the radio to get in touch with Langley.
So I spent some time watching all the special features for the DVD, and it has a number of different scenes with the visual effects team, and they talk about what they were trying to do with all these scenes. And I remember one thing that the guy mentioned was what they're trying to show is that the helicopter pilot was able to, at the last second, move the helicopter so that it wouldn't crash a little, like a controlled landing. I don't know how they do that, but it's interesting enough. They don't mention the fact that, Gabe and I, we've been to Baltimore before. Do you know many desert landscapes that are around Baltimore?
That was the I mean, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, Jack Ryan seems to be going across the world. I mean, he was like 14 hours away, and then he's all of a sudden in Baltimore. Yep. There's some time dilation things, so I think you just have to kind of suspend your disbelief. But in terms of something we're interested for this podcast, though, I always ask you this when we do a movie: the shockwave, the blast. How did this stack up? Realistic? Not realistic?
I don't think it's that bad. Okay. It's actually it's pretty good. The visual effects team in the special features and stuff, really, I was impressed because Derek Spears, who is a visual effects supervisor for the film, he talks about the three different phases of they call the trilogy of the nuclear effects, which is the first, the hospital window, second, the motorcade shockwave, and then 3, the helicopter crash. And the guy actually talks about Derek Spears. He says he wanted the scene to look, and he describes it, there's the heat wave that doesn't knock things over, but it causes damage. Then there's a concussive wave front, and then after that, there's a vacuum, which is true. When you have all this heated air being pushed away, there's a vacuum that gets filled by cooler air rushing back into the center. So that is a real thing, and a lot of the damage in a nuclear explosion is in that second vacuum, and that's also where it's really bad with fire, is because that
just stokes the flames.
Right. The more the center of the where the aim point is, the ground zero, the more that's hot, it's pulling in cooler air, and it creates this vortex tunnel situation where you get firestorms. I like the fact that he tried to put all of this nuance into it. He talks about how hard it was to time the cars flipping over. They couldn't just shoot a car with an explosive device that would flip it over. They actually built hydraulic arms that more slowly lifted the car over, so it looked like wind was picking it up.
Yeah.
So they did all of this work, and it's not bad. It's described pretty well. You see this mushroom cloud starting to form. It clears out the cloud cover, which would happen because of the heat vaporizing all of the water vapor. I don't know what's going on. There's a red center on the top of the mushroom cloud. I don't really know what that is, but maybe someone can comment on the podcast.
It's like the gooey red center of it.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on there. It was a ground burst, so I don't know where that is. What's going on up there? But there's a scene that I haven't seen before in a nuke movie that was really effective. They showed the base of the mushroom cloud with all this black smoke, and it rushed towards the camera and enveloped the viewer.
Yeah.
That was a really great scene because it was this terrifying, almost demonic smoke.
Yeah, it was like black and
Right.
exactly.
I loved that particular piece of it. They mentioned that the fallout pattern is north and east, which they say over the radio at some point. That means it's going out to sea, so we don't have to worry about that. But if you look at Baltimore, north and east is Philadelphia.
Yeah, and then New York after
Right.
that. That's
And if you go straight east, then you hit poor Wilmington, Delaware.
yeah.
Anyways.
For those who aren't experts in the pod, Tim has some Delaware in his past. So.
I spent some time in Wilmington, Delaware. Lovely place. But...
Okay, here's one thing I wondered too about the blast is that it's not like they just set this off. This was like shown, the bomb was shown as being in the bowels of the stadium, which is a lot of concrete surrounding it. There's a lot of structure there. I mean, what do you think? I mean, why would you put it there? All that structure is going to absorb a lot of that initial energy. I know the energy potential is huge, but isn't it better that it would be in the parking lot or something like that?
Well, it depends what the goal of it is. If the goal is to just kill the president and to have some kind of an attack, and then there'd be unclear motives, how do you attribute who did it, and you just need that moment of confusion thinking that it was the Russians, then that's effective, because what they're looking for, it's a down payment on a full-scale nuclear exchange. It's not meant to destroy everything.
It's the appetizer, the first course. Yeah.
So in the book, they get this East German scientist. So in the book, it's back to one rogue scientist, right? And this guy knows everything. He doesn't like the fact that the Russians betrayed socialism by fighting against Germany. He doesn't like how West and East Germany is being treated, so he designs the weapon, and he actually turns the single-stage fission implosion bomb that they get access to into a thermonuclear bomb, which is like megatonnage style. That's not really how it works. You need uranium sources. It's really complex to do a two-stage bomb, because literally what it does is a thermonuclear bomb is a hydrogen bomb. It uses the energy in X-rays from a fission primary stage and fuses together hydrogen, which releases way more energy than a fission bomb, and it has like a two-stage device. That is really hard. Tom Clancy, as much of the praise I've been giving him, rest in peace, don't speak well of the dead, but that is nonsense. So in that one, the goal was to flatten all over the city of Denver, as opposed to this one, which has just caused mayhem.
Yeah, right.
I do think pulling out Nuke Map, I think I saw in your notes too, John, you used Nuke Map, which is a tool built by Alex Wellerstein at Stevenson Institute of Technology. You can go on there, you can plug in an aim site, you can choose different yields, air burst, ground burst, all that stuff, and you can see roughly what an effect of a bomb would be. And according to the film, they say that the blast crater was 100 to 150 yards across. I put that into Nuke Map and plotted it out, and here's kind of where I see. Using the M&T Bank Stadium, which is where the Baltimore Ravens football team plays, as the aim point, a ground burst attack, and trying to make a 100-yard diameter crater, the bomb would need to be at least 13 kilotons, so on the high end of the efficiency of the MK-12, but pretty close to what they were going for. That would produce about 14,000 casualties, 46,000 injured, a fireball radius of 730 feet, so pretty big, but not that huge in terms of a megaton style bomb. But it would produce 20 psi air blast, type of air blast shockwave that can knock over concrete buildings, only out to about 1,600 feet or 0.5 kilometers. There would be an air blast of 5 psi, which would knock over residential buildings out to 1.7 miles, and an air blast of 1 psi glass breaking shockwave out to about 1.7 miles. Yeah, so it's very interesting, because I think you actually plotted, I didn't think to do this, you plotted where Johns Hopkins University is.
Yeah, so I looked at there are two sort of references to which hospital she's in. At one point it's Johns Hopkins, and then later on in the film Ben Affleck says, what's the deal with Memorial Hospital, because that's Kathy's hospital. And I'm not familiar with Baltimore except what I've seen on The Wire, which doesn't focus heavily on the hospital side of things. But I went on to Nuke Map and basically compared these two. If you take Memorial Hospital, it's way out to the north. If you take Johns Hopkins, to get a 1 psi blast that encompasses 50% of that hospital, you need about 20 kilotons.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot bigger than it is in the the film.
Yeah. And then there's the speed of from between the flash and the blast as it reaches the hospital as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, they certainly seem to have done their research on the actual effects of the bomb on the stadium and on the site for sure.
Overall, Gabe, 13-ish kiloton bomb would produce that size of a crater that they say. It probably would need to be larger for the shockwave to affect where the hospital is.
Gotcha.
And where the president's motorcade is, and also where Jack Ryan is. Like, all of that, it's a little bit off. They're unclear about kind of where those are, so you can always fudge the numbers of where the helicopter is.
Sure.
The helicopter looked like it was in, like, farmland.
Yeah, it seemed to be far out, but, I think once you don't have to get too far away from the city to start to hit some of that, but, this whole event, clearly, like, the city is in ruins, but for our purposes, so the president's motorcade's been flipped over. They recover the president.
Mm-hmm.
He looks
more helicopters.
Yeah. Right. He looks shaken up, but functional. The CI director William Cabot, who was in the motorcade, he looks pretty bad.
Yeah.
He's taken quite a beating. Jack Ryan, he claws his way out of the helicopter wreckage. He also is functional. I think his leg is hurt. The pilot, as John said, is dead. We got to get into what the hell just happened mode.
Yeah.
Oh, and on the other side of the world, they wake up the Russian president and let him know what happened, and he makes some comment like, I hope this wasn't us.
Yeah.
Like, I really do. They don't even know what did it. So
I love it. He says, prepare a statement of denial and sympathy.
Right. Yeah. Those are two of my favorite. That's my favorite kind of statement to write.
Hallmark cards should say that. I didn't do it, but I'm sorry that it happened.
Exactly. But the president, they bring him to it must have been Andrews Air Force Base or somewhere nearby, and they bring him on this 747 that looks like Air Force One, but is actually
they call it the NAOC. They never actually say I think in the film what it is, but it's the National Airborne Operations Center, which is a mobile command center on a Boeing E-4B, which is used by the National Command Authorities during a time of war. Its nickname is Night Watch, which is the name of the episode of Madam Secretary that we covered for the podcast. It's always ready at a moment's notice. There's always one of them that's fully staffed and fueled. There's 3 others that are in reserve at all times. It can fly continuously for at least 72 hours, being refueled.
Right.
And this is a question for you all. The reason why it can only go 72 hours is because at that point, the oil in the engine starts to break down and that needs to be replaced. Can you not do that while the plane is flying?
No, you couldn't change engine oil. Yeah, because you think about it, the oil's, there's little metal parts that are building up in there. The oil's getting broken down by heat, and so any airplane, there's a lot of rotatable parts. There's stuff that there's only so much time the airplane can spend in the air before it needs to be brought down for maintenance. They get checked and maintained for regular stuff quite often.
Okay. Well, this plane, the plan in real life, stepping away from the movie for a second, the plan has always been to take the president, during the Cold War, for a large part of the Cold War, if the president's at the White House, you get him on a Marine helicopter that takes him to Andrews. It's like a 10-minute, 5-minute trip.
Yeah.
You get them there. They get on either Air Force One or this particular plane, the NAOC. It used to be called the National Emergency Airborne Command Post, or NEACP, and they pronounce that kneecap. However, in practice, it turns out this is really difficult to do. Brzezinski, former national security advisor for President Jimmy Carter in 1977, decided to do a drill, and it was hard. They called it a complete nightmare, a total disaster, because they couldn't get the president to Andrews in time for it to work. There were all kinds of problems. The helicopter that was supposed to get them there was almost shot down by Secret Service because they didn't know that it was incoming. They're like, what the hell is this? It's different than the normal helicopter. What's going on? There was thunderstorms in the area that delayed the drill, so Russians better not launch something against us during bad weather, and all kinds of problems. And they also realized that a single megaton bomb could destroy the White House and Andrews at the same time. Or you would just put something there. It was too vulnerable. So they moved the location of the plane secretly in Indiana. But at some point, Senator Dan Quayle, bragged about it in a press release because he wanted to show how much money he was bringing into the state. And they're like, don't do that, right? So then it kind of floats between, now it's in Omaha.
And is it almost looked like it's in Omaha. I mean, if you look at Omaha, it's very close to the kind of geographical center of the continental United States. I was wondering if they keep it there just because no matter where the president is, it's, maybe a 2-hour, maximum 2.5-hour flight from where it needs to be or something.
Yes, and also it's the center of the country, meaning it's the furthest that a bomb or missile or bombers can reach. So that's where Strategic Air Command is based out of. A lot of our land-based missile silos are in that part of the country so that they have more time to get up and out of the silo before an incoming bomb hits. There's all kinds of things.
Yeah, but it looks like a pretty interesting plane. I mean, whereas Air Force One, I think, is kind of a flying residence, a flying White House, this almost seems like more of a flying, I don't know, Pentagon, but a flying command center type thing.
Yeah, I if you guys look in our show notes here, I have a picture of like a kind of cutaway of what the plane looks like. This is from, I believe it's Popular Mechanics. This is an article. I'll link to this in the show notes. But you can see the different crew quarters, the conference room. They have the secure communications line. Everything looks exactly as it does in the film.
Yeah, and
it's great.
I watched a video on YouTube where somebody got to take a tour and they took some video, and I really looked almost exactly like it did in the film, which I thought was good attention to detail. But this looks very Spartan. This is not a comfort. When you see Air Force One, there's like plush chairs. This is like command stations and very Spartan type crew quarters. It's a very different kind of airplane, even though they're both essentially heavily modified 747s.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a testament to how far the US is prepared to go and how much money they're prepared to put into preparation for this kind of scenario, that you can keep one of these things ready in all respects all the time, because the amount of technology, the amount of, like, when I was flying helicopters for the Navy, we flew an older aircraft, which this is, and the number of times that we had, tiny things that were completely acceptable for us, oh, well, that piece of kit doesn't work, that's all right, we're not going to use that today, so we'll go out and we'll do the job with everything else. That's not really an option when your job is, coordinating the USA's nuclear triad and the complete command and control. So to have every piece of kit on this jet working 100%, or to have a jet with everything working 100% of the time, is an absolutely phenomenal effort, and that itself must act as a signal to other nations, like, hey, we're not kidding. We've got these bunkers, we've got these jets, we've got the nuclear triad. We're prepared. Kind of come at me. This is the amount that we're prepared to put into something which everything we do is working towards never having to use it.
Come at me, bro.
But as long as the Russians don't hear about all these stories about, we tried to drill on this and it didn't work.
Yeah, that's kind of problematic, isn't it?
No, but that's a great point. And John, I think I read online as well that when the president, I don't know if this is true, but this might be fake news, but when the president flies in Air Force One, they actually have one of these following him on international trips. So not only the cost to maintain and keep it on a high state of airworthiness, but then to actually be operating it, that's just an empty plane that's following the president around. It's just wild.
Yep. So back in movie world, the White House really thinks that it was the Russians. The military is convincing them, like, look, you need to strike back somehow. Jack Ryan's mission is to convince the president and his CIA colleagues that it wasn't the Russians. It should be a pretty easy job, given the information he has.
He can't reach Cabot.
And no one else is taking his calls.
And I think the interesting thing, too, is American leadership, the president and everything, they're really primed to think that this was a Russian attack. And I love all this part of the movie because at the beginning when they have the drill at Mount Weather, everything is so, like, we know exactly what's happening. It's scripted. Boom, 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 let's do this. And here they're getting on the plane and he's asking the Secretary of State, what do you know? He said, I don't know anything. And they're just arguing with each other. It's very irrational. It's very confused.
The president's angry.
Yeah, the president's angry. People are injured. People are tired. I love, too, that the plane, there's constantly turbulence on the plane, so everything's shaking around. The camera's moving. It's just very chaotic. And I think it was a really great, it just sets it up great to show that difference of drill versus real life.
And then to contrast that, we cut to a scene where the Austrian industrialist Nazi guy is calmly eating some dinner, drinking some wine, watching a TV report about casualties and everything. And he calls up his Russian friend that we see from earlier in the movie, and he says, yeah, time to start more trouble. That Russian turns out is like a commander at a bomber wing, or maybe an airfield. I don't think it's bombers, probably like jet fighters and stuff.
Yeah, some sort of airborne strike type thing.
And he runs into the room and says, "The U.S. has just launched an ICBM that's taken out Moscow. We need to strike back. And the way to do that is to like attack an aircraft carrier."
Yeah.
Not really proportional, but maybe that's all that they can do. So they go and do that. They go and try to sink an American aircraft carrier. And once this attack happens, the White House, the mobile White House, basically is like, yeah, we're in a shooting war now with Russia. Board the plane, POTUS, the president of the United States, tries to send a message to the Russian president to figure out like what's happening.
They're using this weird like AOL Instant Messenger type thing.
They type it out.
Yeah, is this? I mean, what is this a real thing or?
Oh yeah. This is one of my other favorite parts of this film.
Okay.
They use what's called the Moscow-Washington hotline, also known as the Moscow Link, or shorter Mo-Link, like Mohawk, but Mo-Link. This is the red phone, but it's not the kind of one you see in most movies and TV where it's a literal red phone and you're on the line, kind of like Failsafe, the movie Failsafe, that we covered on the podcast before, where you're on a literal phone with the president. It's kind of like Dr. Strangelove type thing, where you're trying to chat. It was actually inspired by Dr. Strangelove and those communication things. Famous deterrence theorist Thomas Schelling encouraged the United States to create some kind of communication line similar to Dr. Strangelove. But in real life, it's not a phone. It originally started as a teletype type system where an English speaker, the president, would say something into the system, and a person on the U.S. line would type it out. It would get sent in English to the Russians, and then someone on the Russian side would translate it and read it out to the president. So it's translated that way. So it's pretty quick communication, but it's not written in Russian. It's not a phone communication. The reason is, communicating verbally, you get things like emotional pieces to it. Near instantaneous translation is hard. When you do simultaneous interpretation, you can interpret tone, but it's a little more clear. And they realized during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was no good way of like communicating. The official channel would take several hours to get a message back and forth. So this system has been around since June 20th of 1963. It was called the Memorandum of Understanding Regarding the Establishment of a Direct Communication Line. It worked pretty well. According to an article in 1998 in New York Times, this is important to the film. If the message were to suggest an imminent disaster, such as an accidental nuclear strike, the Mo-Link team would call the Situation Room duty officer, and the gist of the message, the main elements for him, would be translated and relayed to the president. This is quickly followed up by a more meticulously translated message. And when the president is away from the White House, the president can be quickly patched into the Mo-Link through special equipment that accompanies him at all times. One little kind of fun fact here is you have to test this thing to make sure it's working in between our diplomatic crises. So that Americans would often send out messages that were like excerpts from Mark Twain, Shakespeare, first aid manuals, and things like that. The USSR would send quotes from Anton Chekhov. Given Gabe's love of Star Trek, I thought I'd bring that up.
There you go.
But yeah, so that's how they would test it and things like that. And the Russians said, please stop sending us regular messages, because they want it to be used for like when it's a problem.
Right.
But they still have to test it, right? Now it moved from this teletype system to a fax machine during the Reagan administration, and now it's actually more like an encrypted, near instantaneous email system.
Okay, so more similar to what we saw in the film, where they're sending electronic messages back and forth.
Absolutely. So in the movie, the Russian president sends his thoughts and prayers to the U.S., denies any sort of involvement. The U.S. promises to defend itself against further attack. So the Russian president raises the alert level. They're concerned about the U.S. using this as the guise of like a first strike, like a justification. So we're really seeing this like back and forth. The U.S. POTUS accuses them of not being in control of his own military. There's lots of like back and forth about, you were the ones who used the atomic bombs against Japan.
Right.
And you see a breakdown because these two people don't know each other. There's no trust there. There's like fighting in the war room between the different people about like the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense has a heart attack at some point, which is crazy. But finally, the president agrees to initiate snap count, SNAPCOUNT, which I'm not sure what that really is. I couldn't find any reference to that term being used elsewhere, but it's kind of like a heightened version of DEFCON 1, high alert status, and the important thing is stops communication between the president and the rest of the world. So it's like to stop messages from being sent in that are going to confuse things.
Do you think they say snap count because it's the nuclear football? Snap count is a football term. It's the count before the quarterback receives the.
Tom Clancy may have written that as like I don't know what this is, but I'm going to just inject this. The reason why it's called the nuclear football is because back in the day, the nuclear attack plan was nicknamed Dropkick. And what do you need to dropkick but a football?
Yeah.
Was this so this I kind of wasn't really clear to me 100% what at what point the decision actually was made that we're going to launch the missiles.
Right.
And it seemed to be that kind of started with snap count. Like as soon as you say initiate snap count, that's it, we're launching. There didn't seem to be a sensible kind of progression that I could follow.
Sure.
Between going to DEFCON 1 or whatever, and then going okay, it's all gone wrong. We got to launch the missiles because they go through.
Yeah.
They go through this conventional retaliation first.
Yeah.
Where they bomb a Russian airfield, which they make it sound like, we'll use F-16s, it'll be fine. Yeah, right. So they've gone through that, but then they kind of just, without very much more discussion, it's like, well, yeah, the Russians might be up to something. We better start the nukes.
Yeah.
It just didn't seem to be very. There was no real point at which this is the big one.
This is one of my gripes a little bit. I mean, fundamentally, what they're struggling with here is this prisoner's dilemma type game, right? Where neither side knows what the other one's doing. Clearly, the worst outcome is if we both have war, but each side thinks that the other side is going to strike first. In a prisoner's dilemma game, ideally, neither side strikes. But if you think the other guy's going to strike, then you strike too. And then you end up in this horrendous situation where there's absolute war. And you're right, it was never laid out. It wasn't clearly developed how we made that jump from conventional war to nuclear. Maybe it's the fact that the nuclear bomb actually did go off, but I would have liked to see more explanation about how this prisoner's dilemma game would unfold in a situation like that.
Yeah,
especially for the lay viewer.
It seemed to me like they were trying, or the director or the screenwriter or whoever was trying to get a lot of nuclear warfare doctrine into this scene. A lot of stuff about counterforce, about if we take their ICBMs out in their silos. At one point he says, if we take their ICBMs out in their silos, I think he'll call it a night. He'll push back from the table. He's still got 300 nukes that he can use to destroy all of our cities, and that kind of goes without any alternative. There's no, and it just felt to me like there was the screenwriter or the director, whoever, was like, right, we've got all this really good information, this really important stuff for people to understand about how these decisions have been made, but these decisions have been made over years and years and years of thinking about it. It's not like 20 seconds in an airliner. They just, for my money, they tried to force too much in there, and the real decision making and the idea that the president was kind of losing his marbles a little bit wasn't. They didn't really do as good a job as they could have of making that point and focusing on the psychology rather than on the nuclear tactics.
I would say that probably some of the movie is meaning to say that it is chaotic. People are just trying to remember their planning, but everything's kind of falling apart because at any moment they think someone else is going to launch first. Yeah, you're right. They mentioned non-nuclear counterforce targeting. Counterforce is where you a strike against the other side's military, versus counter value, which is you go after things that they value non-military, which could be cities, it could be resort homes, it could be industrial sites. The hard part about that is that you have to, there's certain things you do during a counter force strike, conventional one, non-nuclear, that signals to the other side that you may be preparing for a first strike nuclear attack. By taking out some military installations, it could be softening the enemy for a full-scale attack. And then when the Russians put their weapons on high alert so that they can launch them in case of a first strike, may signal to the other side that they are getting ready for a nuclear attack. It's super hard to balance defense versus offense and how you signal things to the other side, for sure. And the very idea that we'll get into a limited nuclear war where we strike quickly against all of the Russian silos, all of the Russian bombers, we'll cut our losses as much as we possibly can, and Russia after this will just be like, yeah, no problem. We'll just we'll keep our remaining mobile missiles, and that'll be our deterrent, and they'll back down. Is, I think, a fantasy, but it is a real part of real war planning, escalation control, limited nuclear war. Arguments you hear a lot in the United States about why we need more lower yield nuclear weapon options is to fight that kind of conflict, so it doesn't have to go from conventional skirmishes to immediately a full-scale nuclear world-ending war. That's an argument that's real, and the movie certainly shows and plays that out. It's hard, because while at the same time, Jack Ryan is trying to convince everyone that it's not the Russians, so he needs to know. He yells at this like radiation detection team, which in the movie they don't ever say who these people are. It's assumed to be a Nest.
I think they said Nest at some
Did they
point.
say Nest?
Yeah.
In the book, it's clear that it's Nest.
Right.
He yells, "I need to know where this bomb came from." They send in a robot drone who like collects samples, and I'll just talk really quickly here because I know we're getting long on nuclear forensics, which is a type of real world science that you try to determine where radioactive material, fissile material, comes from. In the movie, they determine that the nuclear material that was detonated came from the United States. It came from Savannah River site, which is a Department of Energy plutonium production facility that helped during the Manhattan Project, and it makes a lot of plutonium for the United States. They say not only did it come from Savannah River, they know it was built in 1968 and from a particular reactor, a K reactor in Savannah River. There's this funny line about the guys who are doing the Nest analysis are like, oh yeah, they always had that gadolinium problem. Hanford did it a different way, but Savannah always produced so much promethium, which is funny. Too much promethium, I'm calling as my next band name. That kind of science is real. It's a huge priority for the United States. The government, U.S. government and Congress has put a lot of money into nuclear forensics. I heard the best description of how hard that is to do, though, came from a conference I was at where someone in the Army who was doing nuclear forensics described it as if you have a cake and you explode the cake and you are now bringing someone in to say, all right, who built this cake? And it was like, well, you have all the individual ingredients that you can maybe trace back, but when you explode something, it changes the molecules. It heats up. It changes into something else. It's scattered around. That cake is radioactive. It's kind of hard to collect all that information. To underscore that, an article that I read in preparation for this podcast, written by Phil Baxter, who's a real nice guy, real smart analyst. He used to be with the National Defense University. He wrote an article called "The False Hope of Nuclear Forensics" that I recommend. And his argument there is, forensics can help you determine who didn't attack you by like eliminating certain sources and things like that. But it's really hard to make quick decisions based on that information because nuclear forensics takes a really long time. He said that it probably takes around 21 to 90 days, optimistically, to get information back to use as part of intelligence. And by that time, you're already needing to make a decision how to respond. And nuclear forensics requires you to have access to the original isotopes to understand what signatures are being there. If the U.S. doesn't have access to the Russian fissile material, it can't match it up. Fortunately for this, the U.S. had those sources, so it could match it up. But yeah, so more likely in those situations, you're likely to get false positives as well because it's not like a single blended scotch. Fissile material is often mixed from different places and different sources.
Single malt scotch.
Thank you. So it's really hard, but the point is Jack Ryan knows that it's domestic source of plutonium. He doesn't know yet the connection between the U.S. and Israel, but he knows that he needs to contact Cabot. He finds Cabot. He's dying in a hospital, a pop-up hospital somewhere, and the last thing he says before he dies is contact Spinnaker. He pulls up.
This is this back channel guy, yeah.
He gets his phone. He calls him. He or maybe texts him a little bit, and we find out that Spinnaker says the U.S. gave the plutonium to Israel. Now we know. But Jack Ryan can't get that information to the president because of everything's kind of shut off. Jack Ryan does find out, though, that Kathy is still alive, but he can't, he's busy.
Yeah,
so he can't do anything. So he tries to get this over to the president. John Clark also finds out that the plutonium was found in the desert. He does that by visiting someone that was dying of radiation poisoning because he's reading the internet and it was posted on the internet about someone dying. I'll just note again here that touching plutonium does not give you radiation sicknesses because you can hold it in your hand. It won't make you sick, but whatever. It's not as important. But if you find plutonium on the ground, call somebody, but it's fine to pick it up.
So while Jack Ryan and John Clark are all running around, so the situation does escalate in terms of the nuclear conflict, right? We had talked about before there's a conventional warfare attack on a Russian airbase, but then there's this kind of decision that the U.S. is going to up the ante a little bit, right?
Yeah, it's kind of scary. The Russians see a lot of. They say if the B-2s, the B-2 Spirit, the stealth bomber, if those are in the air, that's the final signal that something's happening. And of course, that happens. So the Russian president, the Chaget, their name for the nuclear football, gets activated, and it looks like things are going to go bad. Jack Ryan knows that he has to talk to the president. The Secretary of Defense receives the call and says, I don't trust you. And that's before he has his heart attack, of course. So Jack Ryan goes to the National Military Command Center at the Pentagon and convinces the desk watch officer to let him use that secure line so that Jack Ryan can send a message to the Russian president.
Yeah.
And he says, look, I know you know me. We're friends. I know about your dating habits. You can trust me. We know that it was the material came from Israel. That came from the United States. Just trust us. Trust me so much. Eventually, the National Military Command Center, who does manage the MOLINK in real life, they cut him off. But the Russian president says, I believe you. I'm going to pull back my forces. Then everything starts to calm down. That's kind of how things pretty quickly de-escalate. But it's this personal connection between the Russian president and Jack Ryan that saves the day.
Start the sequence. We've got activity on the hotline.
They've had their chance.
No, somebody's talking to the Kremlin.
As you can imagine, there has been much confusion here and fear. But we know the weapon was not Russian.
Who are we talking to?
Ryan, I met you in Moscow with Bill Cabot. Died today in Baltimore.
Cut him off.
The system is set up so you can't cut it off. That's the whole idea.
Then get somebody down there to stop him.
Back down.
Can we also talk about and this was a little bit before, when the president does actually order the attack, the way that goes down, because it's very different than in the drill in the beginning where he calmly says, this is the number, and I order the strike. And
he can't remember what the right code was on the biscuit. His voice cracks.
Yeah, he's kind of sheepishly saying, yeah, do it. And they actually ask him, can you please confirm? I didn't hear you. Do you want to do this?
Yeah, I thought James Cromwell did a really good job of portraying a guy at the point of what must be absolute duress, just kind of at the same time as having a nervous breakdown as having to start World War III. It's quite a scene actually.
Yeah. No, I thought it was well done. I guess that just one thing, another nit of mine at the end. So Jack Ryan does save the day by convincing the Russian president to stand down because they have this connection. What's unclear for me, so what happens then is the U.S. president reciprocates by saying, let's call off our strike.
And he had already given the order. He had already that 1 minute window, according to the movie, they're in that window.
Exactly. So they're very close. What I don't understand, though, is how is the prisoner's dilemma game broken by Jack? Because clearly Jack Ryan has convinced the Russians, but the president doesn't necessarily know that. The Russians send a message saying we're going to stand down,
right?
But that could be a lie. So why would the president say... I don't understand why having Jack Ryan, somebody that... The president is not aware of this connection between Jack Ryan and the Russian president, so he has no ability to judge whether that rapport would result in an actual stand down by the Russians. How does that message change the U.S. thinking on it? In my mind, to me, that's a very... that was really the worst part of the movie for me, because that little bit, why would the president decide to change his mind based on just that? And
why would the Russians not think that this was a trick? This would be the perfect thing. I'm sure they've war-gamed this out, that a message from MOLINK would be like, oh, this is an error. We aren't launching anything while, the button's being pushed over and over and over again.
Well, I think one of the generals does say that this is, this is a trap. And I think the Spinnaker guy, he's whispering in the president's ear saying, why don't we listen a little bit more? And I think it is that connection that gets the Russian president comfortable. but I don't know what gets the U.S. president comfortable.
Sure.
To me, there was no information to get the U.S. president confident that the Russians actually were going to stand down.
So if I were to do the math on this Sum of All Fears movie, I would say that it probably would be the president would say, all right, let's take it down to DEFCON 3. We have submarines and bombers in the air that can survive a first strike. Let's wait it out to see, because the president clearly does not want to do this. So he's looking for an excuse to pull back.
Right.
And especially this information that, it came from Israel. It's like kind of interesting to him. He wants I love the little note that James Cromwell says at the end. He's like, tell Jack Ryan I want my phone back.
Yeah, right.
He
right
seems to recover pretty quickly from his breakdown, doesn't he? It's like sense of humor straight away.
So Jack and Kathy finally meet up, and they kiss, and the U.S. and Russians sign a new arms control treaty. And I love this scene because there's like opera music playing while they're formally signing this arms control agreement to agree to get rid of nuclear weapons or something, right? It reminds me, I don't know, I'm sure this is either intentional or it's close. It reminds me of the scene at the end of The Godfather during the baptism scene, where there's a lot of like opera religious music playing, and while the two people are agreeing to sign a treaty and all this stuff, all of the enemies and villains of the film are being murdered by rogue agents. So the Austrian industrialist gets blown up in a car bomb by the Russians. The arms dealer from earlier in the movie gets his throat cut by John Clark. The military commander in Russia gets shot by KGB agents, all while it's similar to that Godfather scene where he's saying things like, do you denounce Satan in all of his works? And this version to me is, do you denounce the Satan missile in all of its warheads? Which is the nickname for the SS-18. These are the things I think about when I think about this movie.
You were looking forward to using that one all week, I bet.
All weeks, yeah.
It did strike me that it might be a little bit hasty to just go around the world knocking these guys over. Surely you would want to exploit some of that intelligence material.
But anyway, so there's a big speech by the U.S. president and the Russians who agree to root out and eliminate the WMD. And it says, like, the most dangerous weapons were fired not in anger but in fear.
Yeah.
The sum of all of them, probably.
Well, it's kind of cool because they're doing the president is making this speech. He's on the south lawn of the White House, and Jack Ryan is with Kathy. They're having a picnic, watching the speech on the ellipse just further south of there, and the Spinnaker guy actually comes up to Jack Ryan, and it
turns out it was the old KGB guy who knows where all the bodies were buried.
So he uses this final opportunity in the film to ruin a romantic time consistent with the theme. And the movie ends with the Spinnaker guy saying, "Congratulations on." He gives Kathy a gift as a little token for your engagement. And Jack Ryan's like, "How'd you know that? I just proposed to her this morning." And
a modest gift for your engagement.
He just asked me this morning.
We haven't told anybody about it. How could you possibly know?
He kind of walks away.
His blue eyes, his little smile, like, "Oh, I don't know."
Yeah, exactly.
It's such a different movie than it would be today, because that joke is, haha, I'm spying on an American CIA operative. We know everything about you. It's kind of funny, right?
Not anymore.
But there's little things you can nitpick there about how quickly an arms agreement like this would come about, especially how insecure the Russian president is at home. The Russians would probably be pretty upset about that. The U.S. president would probably get some flack at home for signing this kind of a treaty. All kinds of little things like that. But it's fine. I also think the most probably unrealistic part about this whole story is how quickly they get engaged. When the movie starts, Jack Ryan has not said "I love you" yet, right?
If anyone should know, it's you, that nuclear weapons are the ultimate aphrodisiac.
Yes,
a nuclear bomb in Baltimore. That's crazy.
Well, I did propose to my wife on the beach.
Oh dear.
There we go. Yeah.
There's a famous nuke movie that we're going to cover called On the Beach. Ooh, I was giddy with that one. Sorry, I'm going to stop smiling. All right, so that's the end of the movie. Let's get into. We've already gone, according to my count here, about 2.5 hours. Let's do our parking lot movie discussion. And this reminds me again, since this is the first nuke movie I saw in the theater, I was on a debate trip I was already pretty nerdy. This was the entire year in high school. We were talking about weapons of mass destruction and Russia and all of this stuff. And at the last tournament of the year at Nationals, we went to the theater together to watch this movie. So it was really fun. So I was, Proto Tim, Proto Podcast, criticizing the film, talking about what parts we really liked in the parking lot on the way back to the car. So really, this is the kind of experience where we should chat about non-nuke things, but other pieces too. And but let's talk about not the heroes. Let's talk about the villains. Do you think that this plot in the movie makes sense of starting a war between the U.S. and the Russians, and that I guess the idea is that socialism in Europe can rise back up from that conflict? John, I know you had some thoughts on this. I want to hear what Gabe says too.
The whole neo-fascist thing is it's interesting, isn't it? In the kind of the peace dividend that we were living in when the film was written and when it was filmed, it makes sense, because I remember I was reading a fair bit in current affairs because it was around the time that I was applying to join the military, and there was a lot going on back then about what are we going to do about everyone, or a lot of commentators were saying, this is a real problem. This is potentially a problem for the future. And then after 9/11, that all went away, and the attention shifted elsewhere, and now here we are again with neo-fascism, and the alt-right and all of that sort of that stuff. It's a bit more topical. So I think the idea of nationalism being a threat to the stability of the globalized world that we live in post Cold War, I think that's completely credible. I'm just not sure what the overall strategy was for these guys. Like, what we'll do, we're Europe, we want more power, we're sat in between the two nuclear superpowers, there's a lot of American infrastructure and strategic targets in our sovereign territory.
Yes, that's the part.
I think the most sensible thing we can do is start a full-scale nuclear exchange between these two, and then we will be king of the rubble. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow that a strategic war between the two sides.
The Russians would target Germany heavily, because that's where a lot of our Tornado fighter jets that are nuclear capable are based. It's in Germany.
Yeah.
Like Germany, Austria, Europe. The movie Threads is about a shooting war that starts between the United States and the Soviet Union that gets Russia targets Sheffield in the middle of England. It will happen. Yeah. Europe will be a target for all of these things.
It's like, if you want to take over your neighborhood, let me burn down all the houses around me. Aren't you worried about your house catching on fire?
Yeah. There also won't be global television and internet in a world where Threads happens everywhere.
Yeah, it's pretty horrifying. But I guess that speaks to the inconsistency and the lack of logic on that side of the political debate.
The global television network will be like it is at the end of Threads, where there's a bunch of people that no longer know how to speak English, that are dying of radiation poisoning, that are watching videos of cat skeletons on VHS tapes, and it's the only thing they have access to, and they're wondering, what is a cat? That's the global internet and TV that will exist after a full-scale nuclear attack. But in the book, there's a series of these moments of the villains' plans, right? Because there's the East German scientist who wants to start a war so that Germany can rise back up. Then you have the Arab Front nationalists who are trying to stop the peace process. So Jack Ryan first has to stop a U.S.-Russian war under the guise of this attack, and he convinces the American president that it's not the Russians, it's someone else. So that stops. And then the president is told by the terrorist that, we work for Iran. The Iranian, the Ayatollah gave us our orders. So then the president's like, screw Iran. We're going to launch an attack against Iran. So that's where this moment, because the CIA director is dead and the defense secretary is also dead, Ryan's the next in the line of the two-man rule. And Ryan has this line where he refuses to authenticate the second piece to it. He says, "That is correct," Jack said, his voice growing stronger. "General, it is my duty to inform you that in my opinion the president is not, I repeat, not in command of his faculties. I urge you to consider that if another launch order is attempted." So It's not how it works. There's no veto authority. If he says he's not going to authenticate, it goes to the next person, to the next person, till the president appoints his bodyguard friend to be he appoints a Secret Service agent and says, "You're now the Secretary of Defense. Give me this launch order." Like, that's how it would work. It's a series of these things over and over again, like double climax that the movie, I'm glad, got rid of. All right, last thing here. What do you think is a better, like, terrifying plot device? Movies where there is an intentional use of nuclear exchange, an accident that leads to this kind of an exchange, or pure movies about, like, nuclear terrorism? Because this was something that, I don't know if it's real controversy or it could have just been literal fake controversy by, like, Fox News, because when this movie came out, they were like, why is Hollywood releasing a movie about nuclear terrorism so close to 9/11? They should have not done this. And Ben Affleck was asked about this, and he said, look, if you feel deeply affected or traumatized that you don't want to see anything that has to do with terrorism or the dangers we face in the world, I mean, you'd have to not watch television. But that, I certainly understand that, but by the same token, I'm very proud of the movie. So this was a question here. What do you think is, like, the most effective type of film that deals with nuclear weapons? And do you think do you think this movie should have been released after 9/11, given the content that's involved? My answer is yes. I don't think it matters, but I don't know what you guys' thoughts on. I guess that's two questions.
Well, I guess so to the first question, what's more terrifying? I think the intentional nuclear war, because with the terrorist attack, it's at least more limited. And I think this movie kind of does that. We have a nuclear bomb go off like halfway through the movie, but the real threat is the fact that these two countries will then get dragged into an intentional war. So I think that is the main sum of all fears. But yeah, I mean, I didn't have a problem with it coming out so soon after 9/11. I mean, it's a real thing. It didn't like seem to capitalize off of the attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon. It wasn't like sensational. I think it was a just very well done film highlighting a real issue.
Yeah, John?
I think the accidental versus intentional nuclear war thing, I think they can both be equally as terrifying. It depends on, not realistically, but how logically that progression from an event is followed through to ultimately a nuclear attack. Clearly there's different scales of nuclear attack, but yeah, if you can see reasonable people making reasonable decisions, and all you're doing is getting closer and closer and closer to a devastating war like that, that's pretty terrifying for me, whether it's accidental or whether it's intentional. As to whether it should have been released post 9/11, yeah, I mean, I can understand why people would think that, particularly those that are close to that were closely connected with the attack itself. But if you've got something important to say and it's on an important topic, it's just as important whether it follows a big tragic event like that or whether it takes place. Arguably, you could say that it's more important to have these discussions with big tragedies like that fresh in people's minds, because it underlines the value of human life. That said, if you're going to make a film where you're capitalizing on that and capitalizing on people's fears just for a plot device, I think that's a bit insensitive. But it's always going to be insensitive regardless of when you release the film.
Yeah, I think the part of the point of this is that even in a time of post 9/11 terrorism, real, I guess, older worries of nuclear danger still exist. And the director makes this point that he loves Tom Clancy stories because they're grounded in what's the current threat, what's the current problems. And the director says, quote, "This is a film that shows the danger of how fear can drive our reactions and leads us in the wrong conclusions into responses," which is something I think is incredibly important here. But even just in terms of like the realistic plot side, there was this discussion of like a panel on Fox News where they were bringing people. There was like a movie critic, some other random person, and one of my favorite people in the nuclear community. His name is Joe Cirincione. At the time, he was with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and now he's the president of the Plowshares Fund. And he was asked about if this movie was realistic, and he has a really great line here where he says, of course, the movie takes liberties with things like whether or not the CIA agent would actually go in the field or not, but the central premise, could a country lose a nuclear weapon? In the movie's case, it's Israel. But yes, we've lost nuclear weapons. Could you find the weapon? Yes, people have acquired these, or may have acquired these weapons in the past. could you get a Russian scientist to repair the weapon? Yes, Russian scientists are available. And finally, could you smuggle it into the United States? Unfortunately, yes. So the central premise that a terrorist could find, repair, and smuggle in a device and blow up a part of Baltimore is unfortunately all too real. And I think that's why this movie is as powerful as it is to me, is because all of those individual steps make sense. Now, separate from whether or not the logic of the Austrian industrialist motivation, I kind of wish their motivation was just to wreak havoc as opposed to create a new world order in a post-nuclear age. But that's fine. That doesn't make much sense. But all right, so we've talked about this a lot. Let's rate it, because we have to, put our mark in the world. Normally we have a consistent 1 to 5 rating system across all of our different topics, but I like to be super critical about the rating since I'm going to be super critical about the plot. I run the numbers here. What I think our rating system should be is 1 out of 5 quarters for the nuclear vending machine. 1 quarter coin will get you barely a pack of iridium gum, but 5 quarters will get you some top shelf good stuff. Gabe, what would you rate this film out of 1 to 5?
I'd give it a 4. I remember liking this when I last saw it probably like 10 years ago. I still liked it. I thought generally the plot moved well. There was good action. It came apart. Where I ding it though is the ending for me. Why the president backs away does not make sense. And there's some places for a hyper accurate thing. There's just some stuff that, in terms of time dilation where people travel across oceans in a short amount of time. It keeps going between day and night in Baltimore, it seems, stuff like that just got to me. But no, overall, I think a solid film and well worth a watch given the current state of all this, nationalist movements kind of going on around the world.
What about you, John?
I think I'd give it a 4 as well. I for many of the same reasons. When I first watched the film back in 2002, I didn't really know an awful lot about nuclear topics. I don't know an awful lot about them now, but I certainly know more than I did then. And having had some of the experiences that I've had since then, it's also underpinned the kind of this idea that, human beings are really fallible, and you could have all of these things are all kind of worst case scenarios. But if you keep rolling the dice enough times, it's possible to get them all to line up and to have a big, a huge situation like this. Things that kept it off the 5 spot for me were the fact that the main characters have to be involved in everything. Like you've got in the tail end of the film, you've got Ben Affleck running around, getting in everybody's business, around a firestorm. I understand why they've done it. It's the bottom line, it's an action film, but it just kind of took the shine off a little bit for me. And again, some of the inconsistencies were just a little bit too much for it to get full marks from me.
Yep. I'm pretty close to you guys. I give it a 4.25. I give it an extra quarter there because to me, as someone who's watched so many of these nuclear films, where it is accurate in the effort and detail that it puts into it, I want to give it a little bit more credit for that. It's entertaining. It's a very entertaining movie. It runs pretty quickly. But once Jack Ryan gets to Baltimore, as John mentioned, and it's starting to run around in the fire, and it's just too many convenient moments. Too many things have to line up for this to go well. I like movies where there's a lot of crazy situations that make things go bad, but the thing that solves it is more clear and focused. This is the reverse of that. There's a lot of things that line up to make it go bad, and also a lot of coincidences that make it work near the end. So it almost nailed a perfect nuke movie. It's close, but it just does not take it across the finish line. There's a few things that subtract from the sum of all fears. All right, so let's get into our final element here where we recommend stuff, because if you enjoyed this, you might like some other stuff. I recommend 3 things. First, Peter Feaver's book from 1992 called Guarding the Guardians, Civilian Control of Nuclear Weapons in the United States. It's a great book about how the president orders an attack using nuclear forces, the role of the military in that process, and how it can break down. It's a great summary of all of that stuff. I recommend Chapter 13 of the Nuclear War Survival Skills Handbook that was made in 1987 by Oak Ridge National Labs. The chapter is called Surviving Without Doctors. I want to give Bridget Moynihan a shout out for this movie. She's a doctor. They have all these pop-up hospitals in the midst of a nuclear attack, but I think the theory behind most plans for nuclear war, and especially in a place that's right next to where the detonation took place, you're going to have to survive without doctors because there will not be access to hospital facilities and the resources needed for that for a long time. So check that out so you're prepared. And finally, I recommend a movie called The Fourth Protocol from 1987. It's Cold War spies, and it involves a false flag nuclear attack. And kind of the fun twist here is the villain is a KGB agent played by Pierce Brosnan. Brosnan. I never can pronounce that, which makes all of our James Bond episodes difficult. And Michael Caine is a British spy, and you see Pierce build a bomb on his own, and he puts everything together, and it's a really cool film that involves similar plot. And I like that movie. We're going to cover it at some point in the podcast, but we're going to have nicknames for Pierce Bronson,
or Brosnan.
Whatever. John, what do you got? Do you have some stuff to recommend to listeners?
Yeah, I would recommend a book called The Secret State by Peter Hennessey. It's a history of Britain's kind of all of the sensitive state mechanisms, and it has a heavy focus on how and why we ended up with a nuclear arsenal ourselves, and a little bit about how that's managed. It's the only place other than another video documentary also by Peter Hennessey called The Human Button. Other than that, it's the only place I'm aware of where you find a very detailed and very accurate description of the UK's nuclear firing chain. So it's really, interesting stuff if you're interested in that sort of thing. The second thing I would recommend is a BBC Radio 4 drama called The Letter of Last Resort. It's available on YouTube. And it's a radio play that sees a newly appointed Prime Minister kind of struggling with the concept of writing these letters and some of the paradoxes that they involve. And then the third recommendation that I would have is the film War Book, directed by Tom Harper. It's available on iTunes. It's not super expensive, and it deals with a proposed response to a nuclear attack. In a sort of a government committee, and throughout the film, the audience kind of realizes that there's more to this planning. This is not being done for no reason, and there's a very sinister kind of undertone that permeates the latter half of the film, as well as some pretty obvious sexism. If you can look past that single scene. It's a good film. Yeah,
I've never actually seen it. I've only seen people talk about it, so I'm gonna check that one out.
Okay,
cool. Gabe, what do you got? Anything?
Yeah, since I was so hung up on the prisoner's dilemma aspect here, a lot of the reading on this, if you're not very familiar with it, it can be kind of dense. But there's a great little game online called The Evolution of Trust, where you can actually kind of be in the prisoner's dilemma game yourself and see maybe what it's like when you're not sure whether the other person is being truthful or not, and it nicely fits the theme of coins in the vending machine. So yeah, go have that and maybe see the movie again, and you'll have a better understanding.
Nice. That's a good balance of three kind of sets of different things for people to check out. So terrific. John, thanks very much. I think we've been recording for about 3 hours. Appreciate you doing this on a Saturday. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I knew you'd be a great guest, and it confirmed all of our hopes and dreams. Hope this was fun for you too.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me.
So if people wanted to follow your thoughts and everything on Twitter or anywhere else, where can we?
If they want to know more about Vortex Aero Media, just go to vortexaeromedia.com. And on Twitter, it's same again. It's just at Vortex Aero Media.
And Gabe, thanks as well. Thank back at being in the studio. It was hard around the holidays to get you here, but we'll keep going.
Absolutely.
I have a couple ideas for future episodes for 2019. One will be there's an escape room nearby here where it's a nuclear bunker themed escape room. So I think we might be recording that episode with some friends and then talking about it afterwards. We have some other upcoming episodes, like probably going to do On the Beach. We're probably going to do some sort of episode on the Fourth Protocol. We're going to do something on When the Wind Blows, another classic British nuclear war film cartoon, actually. So we got a bunch of things in the deck. So keep an eye out for that. And again, thanks, Jon, Gabe, for coming on the show. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Supercritical Podcast. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, or you want to tell us what we got wrong, either nuke-wise, helicopter-wise, any of the things that we said that we thought we had expertise on, there are a couple ways you can do that. You can go on our website, supercriticalpodcast.com. We're on Facebook, as we mentioned before, at facebook.com/supercriticalpodcast. I am on Twitter at Nuclear Podcast, and we also have an email account, supercriticalpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the program, hey, go on iTunes or wherever you listen, give us a 5-star review, or if you don't want to have your weird obsessions, nuke-wise, on record, just tell a friend, tell your family member, tell a loved one about how they need to check out this podcast if they happen to like these topics. That would be really helpful and very nice, and we appreciate it anytime someone does that. So until next time, this has been Tim Westmyer.
And Gabe.
And Jon Duke.
And remember, if it's pop culture and radioactive, we are bound to get super critical about it. Have a good one.